Okay, now we're good.
I can give a very quick hi intro for
Sure.
joining on the recording. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Good morning, everyone. I'm gonna share my screen. Cool. Let's see if I can make it full screen. Great. Does that look okay?
It looks good.
Cool. Okay. And I may or may not be able to see everyone. So if something's going on, please unmute yourself and give me a wave. So as Trish mentioned, I'm Sarah Isbell. I'm currently the research director at Pasa Sustainable Agriculture. We're a nonprofit based in Pennsylvania, but we're working regionally. Right now, we're partnering with a lot of different similar sustainable ag groups from Maine to South Carolina. So we're really working with farmers across the Eastern Seaboard. And I'm really excited to talk about soil health a little bit today. This is, as you all I'm sure know, a huge topic. We could talk about this all year. I tried to cram just a little bit of everything into this hour we have together, with leaving lots of time for discussion or questions. So feel free to unmute yourself and pop in during the talk today, or we'll have lots of time at the end. So cool, let's jump in. So my approach today was to do just a really quick, speedy Soils 101, maybe a review for some folks, maybe new info for some folks, and then thinking about some of the indicators of soil health that we can be thinking about as farmers, maybe targeting some management around those specific soil health indicators, and how we can be measuring those indicators on our farm to track them over time. And then getting into some strategies to manage those soil health indicators, thinking about, we call them management indicators. So what are the management pieces that are really impacting our soil health the most? And I pulled some feedback and data from farmers that we work with at Pasa, to share a little bit about how they've been approaching managing soil health. And then again, lots of time for questions. So again, feel free to jump in, or let me know if something's we've already talked about this, or we don't want to hear about this. I'm happy to adjust as we go. Very loose. Okay. So I have to start a soil talk with, what is soil? This is one of my favorite quotes from this very old OG soil scientist back in the day. And he calls it the excited skin of the Earth's crust. And I just love thinking about that, analogy of the skin as soil, because it is this thing that breathes and is alive and is protecting this really important body, our Earth, right? And also just thinking about the variety of soils across the world, across the terrestrial world, and how variable they are, and that not all soil is arable, right? Not all soil can grow food, and the soil that we as farmers are stewarding that can grow food is really important. So thinking about our job as stewards of the soil, as we're growing food for our communities, I think is a really cool and important task. The kind of more classic definitions, less woo-woo definitions of soil: this mixture of minerals, dead and living organisms, air, and water, right? So that surface mineral and organic layer of the earth that has experienced some degree of physical, biological, and chemical weathering. So now we all know what soil is. What is soil health? So we're thinking about that living skin and its capacity, right? So the capacity to function as this living ecosystem, to sustain plants, to sustain animals and humans. And again, we can think about these biological, physical, and chemical properties of that soil. and how those are all interacting to provide us with functions. Okay, so again, trying to be speedy. Speedy soil 101. I gotta remember to speed it up because I just love talking about soil so much. So a lot of times in basic, soil classes, you'll see this kind of circle pie chart, right? With half of the soil being some mineral or like solid material, and half of the soil basically being empty space. So here I've drawn this mineral matter and organic matter as half of the soil, and then that empty space, which can be filled with air or water. Here I just drew it as 50% air, 50% water, but of course that can go up and down based on the conditions. But I think this is a really important thing to wrap our heads around, that a lot of that soil under our feet is empty space, and that empty pore space is really important, right? That's where air is flowing. That's where those macropores and micropores exist to hold and move water, which holds and moves nutrients, and which is really important for our microbial communities as well as our roots to be able to breathe and access water and move through that soil. So I think it's really important to think about this pie chart that I've kind of drawn out over here, but it's also important to remember again that soil is complex. We have all these different particles of different sizes, different chunks of organic matter floating around in there, and of course, are microcolonies of bacteria and probably fungi as well. Cool. So just going through a couple of those properties that we think about as we're thinking about our soils. We have soil texture. This is a fun one everyone loves, right? Maybe some of you have seen this soil texture triangle before. If you've ever heard anyone refer to a soil as, for example, a sandy clay loam. What does that mean? Well, that means that it's a certain percentage of those different particle sizes. So sand, silt, and clay. And I really like this, showing this picture of sand, silt, and clay, just to get a picture in our heads about really the magnitude of difference. So the difference between a sand particle and a clay particle is huge, right? And of course, as we can kind of try to texture the soil, mix it with a little water and feel it in our hands to try to feel any grit or sand. So there's like lots of different ways to interpret the texture of your soil if you don't want to do a lab test. But again, thinking about these differences and understanding this inherent property of our soils, that's really not super changeable in most cases. Moving on to soil structure. So our texture is the sand, silt, and clay combination, and then soil structure is the arrangement of those pieces. So sometimes we talk about the house, right? We have our building blocks of our house, but then how are they arranged? That's our soil structure. And we need a soil structure that can transmit water during a rainfall event and not be available to erode soil particles on the soil surface. So we want this texture to aid our soil in storing water. We want this texture to provide adequate macropores to allow good drainage, and so that air can move into those pores. We also want a soil structure that's not too compact to allow for root growth and organism movement. Okay, so coming into that tiny slice of the pie that I showed as soil organic matter, depending on where you are and how you're cultivating different soils, usually folks say like 3 to 6% of the soil is organic matter in agricultural soils. I think that varies wildly, especially if we have some farmers up in Maine. I've seen a lot of Maine soil tests with like super high organic matter, just again, because of those inherent properties of where your soil was starting, right? Anyway, so the soil organic matter component consists of many different carbon-containing substances in the soil. So sometimes we hear the organic matter pool broken down into this living, dead, and stable categories. So the living categories would include plant roots any living soil animals, those little critters cruising around down there, chewing up plant matter and helping to decompose plant matter, living microbes, both bacteria and fungi. So that living component is included in our soil organic matter. We also have the dead fraction. So this is dead but not yet broken down or decayed plant material, roots, animals, and microbes. So that kind of freshly dead material sounds a little weird, but and then finally that stable organic matter. So as things have decomposed, we get this nice, rich, kind of sweet, I think it's sweet smelling, stable organic matter. Sometimes you might hear it referred to as humus, kind of looks like the word hummus, but it's humus. Soil scientists will debate you about what or if humus really exists, but thought I would just throw that word out there if you've heard it before. So this organic matter pool, there's continuous decomposition in the soil, right? Those microbes are crucial to do this work. And as they're decomposing that organic matter in the soil, nutrients are being released and cycled. And this is really important for the function of our soil, really important for nutrient cycling, really important for plant growth, right? So while the soil biology, soil microbes and fungi and larger animals make up only this really small percentage of the soil volume, they're really involved in virtually every nutrient cycle. In agriculture, we tend to think a lot about nitrogen availability. So approximately 95% of the nitrogen in the soil is organic. So without this organic matter decomposition, inorganic nitrogen wouldn't be liberated from that organic matter. And that's what really plants want to take up, or that's what plants are taking up mostly. So again, I think another really important function, we've talked about nutrients a lot, food for microbes, holding water, so that water holding capacity, as well as aggregation. So we'll get into soil aggregate stability a tiny bit, but those roots and fungi, so mycorrhizal hyphae of the fungi, which kind of look like a little bit like roots, and lots of other soil life really play important roles in building and maintaining those stable soil aggregates. So that, I think, playing into the structure of the soil. Okay, so now getting into that empty space, right? We kind of talked about the tangible stuff. What about that empty space? Just really quickly, soil water. Obviously, it's a source of water for plants, really important, but it's also a source of mineral nutrients for plants. So a lot of nutrients will dissolve into that water, and that's how plants are taking them up. This water might be acidic or basic, and that can play into some chemical components of soil nutrient cycling as well. And finally, soil air. Air is really important in the soil, right? We have lots of living stuff down there that really needs to breathe. So oxygen has to get in and carbon dioxide has to get out. And I think I'm not going to get into this, but we can think about what's going on in the atmosphere, what's going on in the soil, and the kind of mechanisms of moving that air around. But really the most important thing is just understanding and knowing that there needs to be airflow right into the soil for there to be living things down there. Cool. I think this is wrapping up my Soils 101 here, but I couldn't get away without thinking about what causes soils to be different from each other. Soil scientists, I guess, are really bad at acronyms because a long time ago they came up with this acronym CLORPT, which is not a word. I don't know who thought of that, but I guess it's kind of memorable. So these are considered the state factors of soil formation. So climate, organisms, especially those microbes, the relief or topography of a land, that parent material, so that initial rock and mineral, and finally time. And these state factors are what are creating this wild variability in soils that we see across the globe in, again, those physical, chemical, and biological properties. And I just like love looking at this picture of these soil horizons, thinking about being down in this soil pit and being able to see all of these different colors and feel the different textures, maybe see different minerals and different chemical reactions that have happened in these different soils because of these state factors. Okay, so what is a degraded soil? When we're talking about degradation, especially from agriculture, from like overuse, and usually from like a lot of times from human impacts, we're really thinking about that loss of quality. So again, this is related to soil health, right? We talked about soil health is the capacity for this function. So the loss of that ability and capacity to do essential functions is kind of the other side of the scale, right? That degradation. So when we think about degradation, we think about the loss of organic matter, the loss of that structure that we know is so important for water and airflow and root penetration, the loss of nutrients, and accumulation of salts or other contaminants. Heavy metals is a big one in a lot of urban farming, right? As well as acidification. So thinking about that pH of the soil, which can really impact nutrient cycling as well as who can live there. So as we're thinking about maybe improving degraded soils or building soil health or avoiding degradation of our soils, as we're asking our soil to do a lot for us, grow a lot of food for us, right? I think it's really helpful to think about these 4 soil health planning principles that the NRCS has laid out. And we'll get into these a little bit more, but when I am approaching like a farming season or talking to a farmer about their system, I always kind of hold these 4 principles in my head as we're thinking about how we can tweak or add or manage our system for soil health. So thinking about minimizing that disturbance, maximizing diversity, maximizing soil cover, so on top of the soil, and then maximizing living roots under the soil. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but just I needed like a happy slide after the soil degradation slide because it makes me so sad. And finally, I have to just say that soil health comes with lots of co-benefits. So you might have heard the term ecosystem services before. There's this suite of benefits that and services that soil provides or is linked to. So one reason I think soil health is really key in thinking about agriculture is that it supports the productivity of your farm. It supports the resilience of your farm to disturbance, which is more and more important as we know with, climate impacts. And also the ability of your farm to sequester and hold carbon, which I think is going to be a big topic that we're going to be talking about a lot more moving into the future. And of course, more water protection, ecological sustainability, food and energy security, climate change adaptation and mitigation, supporting pollinators, supporting, wildlife. So, I think framing these co-benefits is another really important piece of thinking about stewarding our land. Cool. Okay. We're going to jump in to talk about some of these soil health indicators. So again, we broke down our soil health or soil properties into these chemical, biological, and physical categories. Some of these kind of cross and intersect with each other or overlap. And I just picked a couple to kind of dig into a little bit today. And I think also maybe we'll talk just a little bit about taking soil samples on your farm. Yes, we will. Okay, great. I'm glad I added the slide. So if soil sampling is something that you are interested in planning to do to monitor the health of your soil and maybe changes over time or identify any problems or try to solve for problems in specific areas, there's a couple of different strategies for how you are going to design your soil sampling. So we recommend sampling at the same time each year, For example, at Pasa, when we're sampling on the farms involved in our research program, we sample in the fall. So we try to capture kind of the end of season result of all of our management and all of our cropping, but of course, before the ground is frozen. And that way we can think about over the winter, any decisions we want to make for the next season, any amendments we might want to add, or any other adjustments. We also recommend using the same lab each year. There is variability in the approaches to measuring some of these soil health indicators. So there's different methods, right? Using the same lab each year will really help you make sure you're able to see any changes, since you know that you're using those same methods in all the soil tests. Another big one that I think is important is really taking samples to represent either your fields, your whole farm system, and or problem areas. So really asking yourself, what is my goal for this soil sampling and how should that impact my sampling? So this is like a little bit hard to see here, but maybe you can see in category A, in box A, we're sampling a whole field. So we're just trying to get like a representative sample of the whole field. There's a little weird low spot, and we're going to avoid that because we're like not really worried about that. Maybe we were really concerned about this low spot, and in that situation, we would take 2 samples from this field, right? We would get a representative sample from everything that we feel like is being managed the same, and then maybe we would take another sample in that low spot to try to understand the differences that are happening there, right? Another strategy is maybe thinking about if you have 2 different management systems. For example, this B box is showing zone X and zone Y. One is a no-till, 2-year no-till system, and one is a plow till system. And maybe we want to see the differences between these 2 systems on our farm to try to understand maybe which is more appropriate or which is working best for us. So we'll probably have some information, about yield or about what the crops look like or pest pressure from these 2 different side-by-side management systems. So we don't want to combine them when we're looking at soil, right? We want to keep those separate. So again, just depending on, there's no right or wrong way, right? It's just depending on what you want to know and making sure you're designing your sampling to address those questions. Cool. Let me check the time here. 9:30. Okay, we'll fly through a couple of these. I might skip over a few. So when you send your soil sample off to the lab, so I'm just, we use the Cornell, we send our soils to Cornell. There's lots of different places to send your soils, right? You can send it to Penn State. I think Rhode Island probably has a place. I don't know. Has a place? Nope. Rhode Island doesn't have a place to send them. But again, like just
we usually recommend UConn or UMass.
UConn. Great, thank you. And they're all great. Again, I think it's really like great to be just consistent about where you're sending your soil year after year. So these are some of the indicators that might be measured. Again, these are from the Cornell tests. So some of the methods here might be specific to Cornell, but a lot of them are used widely, especially across those labs. So again, you'll get back this information about your soil texture. You'll be able to say, oh, I do have a silt loam, and it's because I have this percentage of these particles, and that is going to inherently constrain some things I can do with my soils, right? So I don't want to be comparing my silt loam soil to my neighbor who has a sandy clay soil. Like, we're just going to have different soil health results because of those inherent properties. So it's an important benchmark. Another thing that we can test in the lab is available water capacity. So another one of these physical indicators that's telling us how much plant available water can this soil hold. So you might hear some words like field capacity. That's kind of the upper, oops, sorry, I kind of typed that weird. That's like the upper end of the range of our available water capacity. And then that permanent wilting point, which is when there's only water, only water unavailable to plants is left after free drainage. So that's kind of our range there. And you can see over in this diagram, there is like the saturated soil level, which is above field capacity. And of course, when the water is super, super dry and you've gone beyond the permanent wilting point, but understanding that availability of your soil. I promised we would come back to aggregate stability. This is a big one that people always have a lot of questions about. I like to think of this indicator as answering the question, how well can the soil hold up to disturbance? So again, this could be tillage disturbance, this could be heavy rain disturbance, this could be animals or compaction disturbance. So it really technically is a measure of the extent to which soil aggregates resist falling apart when they are hit by rain. So they take the soil into the lab. Again, like you've already scooped up the soil, it's been shipped in the mail, they dry it down, they sieve it up in the lab and or whatever, sieve it in the lab and then re-wet it and see how many unstable aggregates will pass through the sieve. So I like to talk about this a little bit because, again, this is a test that represents your soil, but it's not actually what's happening in your field. So sometimes there's a little bit of a disconnect there. And again, it's important to think about, what are these numbers actually telling me? And what am I actually observing in my fields too? And like what matches and what doesn't match and why might that be happening? So, but aggregate stability does have a strong relationship to many soil functions, surface sealing and compaction, drainage, bulk density is one you might have heard of. So the density of your soil, water storage, which goes along with drainage, as well as, again, that resilience to disturbance. Soil organic matter, we already talked about this a bit too, but this is really a central biological health indicator. When people think about soil health, oftentimes they'll equate it directly to soil organic matter. When they think about biological activity in their soil, there's been some work to show you can just kind of look at your soil organic matter or that carbon in your soil to get a great estimate of the life in your soil, right? So the number you get back on a soil health test is the percent of soil organic matter, and this is measured by a test in the lab called loss on ignition. So they just, they burn it and you see how much burns. It's kind of cool. So there's another indicator that you might see also called active carbon. And so this is a fraction of that fraction that indicates just that percent of the organic matter that is readily accessible to soil organisms to munch on. So like, what is that food that's available for the microbes to eat today? Another one that people have some questions about sometimes, so I thought it'd be worth throwing up here. Sometimes you'll get a soil protein index, which is another biological indicator. And this is something folks look at because that soil protein is the largest pool of organic nitrogen in the soil. So we think about, usually about 95% of soil nitrogen is in that soil organic matter. So from this test, we can think about how much nitrogen is really banked in that soil organic matter, right? So it's not something we're going to get from a soil nitrate test, because that's showing us what's available right now in the soil. But this is kind of showing us, okay, what's in our bank as our microbes are munching and decomposing that soil organic matter, and nutrients are being released. What can we kind of expect over the course of the season? Is that pool big? Is that pool small? Okay, I think that's all I'm going to say about that. Great. Another one of these really cool biological indicators that's getting at that microbial activity is soil respiration. So this test, again, is kind of an indicator of how many microbes are in my soil. Do I have a flourishing microbial population, or are things kind of calm down there? And this test asks the question, how rapidly do microbes break down organic matter? So again, important for this nutrient cycling, making nutrients available to plants. Microbes are also important for stabilizing aggregates, promoting plant growth, as well as suppressing disease in our soils. So all of these services aren't being performed without microbes. So to assess if those microbes are active, we can measure this activity. Sometimes people call this like the pulse of the microbes in your soil. And it's measured by, I'll say it really fast. It's measured by capturing and quantifying the carbon dioxide released from some soil that's a little bit wet in an airtight jar. So you can take a dry soil, give it a little bit of water to wake the microbes up, say, hey, microbes, do your thing, and then measure how much they're breathing, basically, how much they're respiring. So a bigger release of carbon dioxide indicates a more active soil microbial community. So I think also it's helpful to hear how that test is done, because again, like in the field, you're not drying your soil and then re-wetting it. So it's not directly related, but it's again, this index or indicator to help you make some decisions and understand what's going on in your soil. Cool. Okay. Does anyone have any questions or anything they want to call out right now? Otherwise, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that management.
Yeah, I've got a question. Can you hear me?
Sure. Yes.
With all the attention that people like Elaine Ingham are bringing to the soil food web, how much testing is being done on types of microorganisms and quantity of specific microorganisms? And then a kind of a follow-up question. I was recently attended a conference where they were talking about DNA sequencing of microorganisms. Is any of that starting to become more popular amongst labs that are looking at soils?
Yeah. Awesome question. Thank you. Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. Yes, I guess I'm going to answer your last question first. Yes, DNA sequencing of our soil, the soil microbiome, it's a hot research topic right now. Part of my PhD, I did some of that work, and I think I learned a lot about its utility in the field. So I think right now we're at a place where, yes, like researchers at universities and institutes are learning a lot of really cool kind of basic science principles and dynamics about how microbial communities are structured in the soil, what's influencing those communities, and what are the functions of different microbial groups by using DNA and RNA, metagenomics, all of those cool, big, fancy words. I think that more labs that are working with farmers are starting to use, you're seeing more and more this other test called PLFA, phospholipid fatty acid analyses. And that will give you some kind of bigger coarse microbial groups. So from that test, you can see, for example, your bacterial to fungal ratio, which is something a lot of farmers are interested in and has impacts for decomposition in your soil, how nutrients are being released in your soil. There's a lot of dynamics with the microbial pool, with also taking up and releasing nutrients. So just as we can think about a cover crop decomposing, and as it decomposes, there's carbon and there's nitrogen, right? The same thing with our microbial community. So as we have a big flush of microbes or bacteria, that microbes and bacteria also have carbon and nitrogen in their bodies. And as they die, that's released to the soil. They also are taking up that carbon and nitrogen from other things. So yeah, there's a lot of really cool dynamics that are going on that are really important for nutrient cycling. That was like a really long rambly answer maybe to your question, but I think in short, it's really cool to get a little bit more information using maybe that PLFA test. You can get some other groups like gram-negative bacteria and gram-positive bacteria, and we kind of generally can say some things about the different functions of those groups or what we might want some balances to look like in our soil. But I think we're still kind of far away from really being able to directly manage our microbial communities in the soil. There's some inoculum, there's things on the market that you can like spread this on your soil to promote this certain bacteria. And I think that researchers are still using exactly like what that you said, like DNA, other genomics methods to really understand, are these products working? What's going on here? How much is this really helping? So I like to encourage people to start with looking at some of these biological indicators included in your kind of standard soil health tests, like that organic matter, that active carbon, and that soil respiration, because that can tell you a lot. Adding, if you have the funds to add a PLFA test, like if you're really curious and really interested, I think it's cool to look at, but I'm not sure we're at a place where we really know how to manage based on that information. So yeah, does that answer your question more or less?
Yes, you certainly did. Great information. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, I could talk about that forever, so we could talk more later if you want. Cool. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts right now?
I have a question.
Sure.
So how do you get started, and when's the best time to do the soil testing?
Yeah, great question. You can start today. So I would say, again, like kind of picking, if you're going to soil test once a year, because again, it's money, right? So budgeting for it is important. Maybe you want to soil test every spring, maybe you want to soil test every fall. Just being consistent is important. Again, thinking about what questions you're trying to ask. So if you are a livestock farmer, or if you're, working with trees, maybe you want a different test or a different time of year for various reasons, right? But I think doing this kind of big suite of tests once a year, especially as you're getting started or working a new piece of land or trying out a new system, is the way to go. There's also always opportunity to do more tests throughout the year, maybe like fewer of these tests. So maybe you just want to look at, I don't know, some like nitrogen, some nutrient or mineral contents throughout the year if you're having trouble in a field, to try to understand what's going on there. But so that would be my recommendation, once a year. And now, we have farmers that we work with who have been doing the soil health tests now every year for 8 years. And they're kind of understanding their system more, they're understanding the impacts of their management, and they might be backing off and say, we're going to soil test like every 2 years, every 3 years now, because we have a good handle on what's going on. Again, I think if you have a farm that's new to you, or a farm where you're having some problems, it's a good idea to start this season with testing. Meredith, was there a more specific, like how to get started question, or was that?
Yeah, is like, do you just go out with a bag and shovel some dirt and then
Yeah.
ship it off? Or
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Gotcha. So different labs will probably have different ways that they want you to sample. So for example, like Cornell, when you're like, hey, I want to send you a soil sample, they say, great, here's our manual, here's the protocol that we want you to use. A lot of times, usually, you will take a slice of soil, kind of like the same width all the way down to about 6 inches. You want to like probably capture that plow layer. And depending on the test, the lab will let you know how much soil they want you to send in. So actually, I can go all the way back. Oops, no, I missed it. Here. So this is what Cornell asks us to do. So they say, pick 5 sites in your field, walk in a zigzag to try to get kind of like a representative but random-ish sample. And then at each site, dig 2 holes and take a slice of soil out of those 2 holes, mix all of that soil together, and then scoop out 5 cups and mail it to us in a double-bagged Ziploc. So that's the process for Cornell. It's pretty similar for other groups or other labs. Depending on the test you're doing, sometimes you can use a soil probe if you have one, but you really don't need fancy equipment. Like a sharpshooter shovel, the ability to dig a hole, and a measuring tape are all you need. Any other questions?
I had a question just about because we had our soil tested, and the and somebody mentioned something about soil conductivity. I don't know if that's something that you're going to mention, or like it's part of the, but I feel like ours is low,
Yeah.
or ours is low,
Yeah.
and so, I'm not really sure exactly how to improve that. And I'm not sure if that's going to be part of the.
Yeah. I didn't pull that today. Let's see. So sometimes they do give you like electrical conductivity or cation exchange capacity, some more of those like chemical indicators. Yeah, I'd have to maybe dig into that one a little bit more, but I'm happy to do that. And actually, I have linked at the end here the Cornell Soil Health Manual that goes through each indicator in a lot of details and talks about which each one is, and like you can think through management strategies to try to target that indicator. With electrical conductivity, yeah, I mean, I'm always just like, build your soil organic matter, increasing those cation exchange sites, adding more water holding capacity, like all of those things will influence that.
There was like, I think there's some folklore about like throwing pennies into your garden or something like that.
Oh, cool. I've never heard that. Okay, I'm gonna look into that one. A copper thing.
Yeah, it has to do with copper.
Yeah, neat. Cool.
My sister puts copper tubing into her garden.
Wow. Okay. Well, copper is also, an antifungal. There's like something, there's some interesting things around some of those like more folklore strategies that probably have like some really cool positive and also maybe negative impacts. But okay, I'm gonna look into that one. I like the idea of throwing pennies in your garden. But yeah, I'm happy to maybe email with you later if you want to dig into that more. Cool. Okay, well, for the sake of time, I'm going to try to fly through a couple of these planning principles again. So coming back to these, now that we've like thought about all these different numbers or indicators that we can be measuring to learn more about what's going on with our soil health. What do we do? So exactly what Michael was asking. If I see I have this like low number, what do I do about it? So often when you get these test results back, there will be some management suggestions, maybe at the end of your soil test, depending on the test. And we'll say very generally like, oh, if you have really low soil organic matter, add more organic matter, or, there'll be some, if you have, this certain pH, you can think about adding this amendment to try to improve the pH. Beyond that, especially if you are, for example, thinking about regenerative or organic or any of those kind of sustainable farming principles, there are things just generally in management that we can do to overall holistically improve our soil health. So it's a little bit of a like rising tide approach. So again, thinking about minimizing disturbance. What does this mean? Reducing tillage, reducing compaction, which is really, we can think about in terms of grazing animals too, right? As well as reducing chemical applications. So chemical applications are considered a disturbance to the soil, they're impacting those microbial communities. What about maximizing living roots? Cover crops, intercropping. I am a huge cover crop nerd / fan. As Trish mentioned, I did a lot of my PhD work thinking about different cover crops, how we can be creatively integrating them into different cropping systems, how we can maybe be using different mixtures or cocktails of cover crops to achieve certain goals. So getting creative or more intentional about our cover cropping strategy to maximize living roots, or again, intercropping with 2 cash crops or intercropping with cover crops in our systems. This also plays into soil cover, right? As we're getting more of those living roots in the ground, we're also getting that cover to protect our soil from disturbance like heavy rains, thinking about, the types of plants we're planting and their above ground habit, right? So grasses go like this, broadleaves go like this, which is protecting my soil more? Do I want to be trying to plant a mixture of these things to add that cover to my soil, growing big biomass cover crops and leaving them as mulch on the soil to protect the soil? Or maybe I'm in a system where I can just bring in mulch. I'm bringing in some of that already dead organic matter, and using that to cover my soil, right? Thinking about maximizing diversity. So a lot of times in agriculture, we can think about both diversity in one space at one time and diversity in that space over time. So thinking about your crop rotation over 3, 5, 7 years, and how that's bringing diversity to the system, mixing annuals, using perennials, adding cover crops, maybe cover crop mixtures. We can also think about the diversity of our animals and those animal impacts, as well as organic matter inputs. You know, again, we can be bringing in a diversity of inputs into our soil. And that diversity, again, is impacting above ground and below ground. We know that different plants have different relationships with different soil organisms. So I think this is a really cool strategy if you want to think about managing your microbes on the soil, right? We know that planting a more diverse above ground community will lead to this above ground, below ground linkage, will lead to a more diverse below ground community. And again, this diversity is really key to protecting against disease and insect pressure. It can help make soils more resilient. And I think is also, again, has a suite of co-benefits if we're thinking about other services we want on our farm, right? Pollination, water, moisture protection, lots of stuff. Cool. Okay. We're running out of time a little bit, so I'm going to move a little bit more quickly. Yeah, I think another way that we've been really pushing folks to start testing their soil, I also want folks to think about really keeping better management records to track your management indicators. So you can really say like, oh, this field, I have higher organic matter than this field. Like, why might that be? And you can say, oh, well, I had, 100 days of a cover crop growing in this soil and only 50 days of a cover crop growing in this soil. And I can track that by my planting and termination dates of my cover crops, right? Or, oh, on this field, I tilled, 6 times. On this field, I only tilled 2 times just because of the weather, or like my equipment wasn't ready to go, or like whatever was going on, right? So thinking about that equipment activity and keeping track of that has a really big management indicator and a way to be thinking about how we can be building our soil health. Organic matter inputs, again, tracking how much compost, manure, or mulch we're adding to our soils. And if you have animals, you can think about your stocking density, your grazing intensity, and how you're rotating and managing those animals. So what are we learning through our research? I didn't talk too much about our research project, but we've been working this year. I think we had 170 farms from Pennsylvania, Maine, and Maryland, keeping track of their management, these management indicators, doing this Cornell soil health test in the fall. And we've been collecting these data we just finished, I think, our 8th season. So what have we learned? Well, tough weather is really tough on soils. We had a year in, I think it was 2018 in Pennsylvania with like really intense rain. And we saw across the board, all of our farms, the aggregate stability dropped. So again, that wasn't like a management decision that any of our farmers could control, right? But we also saw in a lot of those farms that had really high soil health scores that aggregate stability rebounded pretty quickly. So those healthy soils are resilient to these tough disturbances that we sometimes can't control. We're also just learning that every farm and farm system has unique challenges, right? So making sure that you're benchmarking your own farm, your soil sampling, again, to answer the questions that are important to you and to the challenges that you're experiencing. We're also learning that there's no one prescribed pathway to excellent soil health, right? It's not like, you got to do no-till, or no, you got to till, but only this much, right? There's so much variety. And actually we've been seeing like a lot of farms, especially our veggie farms, that use tillage, but also have a lot of other really awesome soil health practices and are adding a lot of organic inputs, maintain really high soil health scores. So it's not so simple, those relationships. What are some of those pathways to soil health? Just having awesome soil to start with. So that's like not always something we can control, but if it's something that, you're looking for land, like making sure that you're looking at these soil health tests or taking a soil health test before you choose to farm a space. Again, like thinking about intensive cover cropping, using different creative cover cropping strategies, including these diverse rotations, integrating livestock into your systems if that's possible. Thinking a lot about the timing of our field operations. I think this is more and more important as we're experiencing different weather patterns and different heat pressure. So maybe timing, like one thing I'm really interested in looking at is if we're tilling not in the hottest times of the year, how is that impacting our loss of organic matter from tillage? And again, this judicious use of organic inputs, and those inputs can come from growing cover crops and integrating them into your soil, from bringing in manures and mulches and composts. Okay, I think this is the last thing I'm going to say because I know we're almost out of time, but again, this is right from our farmers, some things that they've been doing as they've been monitoring their soil health over the last few years. A lot of folks are really committed to no more bare fallow periods for weed control, like really using cover crops whenever possible, investing in new and gentler equipment in the field, planning ahead, being prepared so equipment is ready to go when the weather is right. And this is something that we've heard over and over again, like, there was this perfect day to do that, but like my tractor wasn't ready to go that day. So I ended up having to till a couple times because blah, 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 blah. So again, this like the luxury of time, right? Which we all struggle with, but being able to think ahead and do some of that prep work. Trying to combine passes, so you have less passes of equipment if you're on a more mechanized scale. Using techniques like turping to reduce tillage, or other ways like integrating mulch. Thinking about new cover crops, quote unquote new. I think I would be remiss if I didn't say, a lot of these sustainable practices are really based on indigenous practices, thinking about maybe integrating legumes or integrating something that you haven't tried before on a smaller piece of your farm, and then like expanding as you learn how to manage it, not getting scared about trying something new and how am I going to manage that with the equipment that I have. Longer rest periods for veggie fields if you have the space. And finally, like livestock farmers are doing a whole bunch of cool stuff, keeping tall grass, thinking more about rotational grazing, no-till seeding in pastures, as well as like seeding some annuals for forage. Okay, in conclusion, we can't afford to not think holistically about soil health on our farms anymore. It's really important to know your soil, to learn the best way to take care of it. We need to be thinking about these physical and biological indicators just as much as those nutrients. So classically, a lot of soil tests are just those nutrients, but bringing in this whole holistic picture is really helping farmers to be able to manage their soil. And I would love to see this more widely available to farmers like you all. And there's just as many ways to achieve and improve soil health as there are farms. So it's always going to look different based on what you're growing, your markets, your soil, as well as your lifestyle and like how you want to be farming, right? So there's no right way, but there's many right ways. And so with that, I wanted to just throw up my contact info. I know we kind of ran out of time, but I'm glad we got some questions in there. This Building Soils for Better Crops, I have a very old version of it, but there's a new updated version. You can download it for free. I think it's a really great like reference, and also goes through all those indicators and talks in more detail about how to be managing for those. I linked here the Cornell Soil Health Manual, which kind of does the same thing in a more abbreviated way. And there's a little bit more about our soil health benchmark study at Pasa, where some of these like ideas about management are coming from. Trish, I don't know if there's time for any more questions or if I'm cut off.
Yeah, we need to roll into the next speaker,
Okay.
but I do have some questions for you, so I think I'm going to follow up with an email.
Sure.
And then I'll share that with the class, just about like resources for cover cropping,
Yes.
and to get some of these links so that I can include it.
Great. Yeah, and I'm happy to send these slides.
Great.
And if anyone wants to email me, I'm happy to chat or like set up a call or whatever would be helpful.
You have some thank yous in the chat box.
Oh,
Sarah.
thanks.
And
Thanks,
thank you. That was
Really?
fabulous. Thank you from Meredith.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Enjoy the rest of the program. Talk to you later.
thank you. Bye.
Bye.
All right. So our next, does anyone need a break? A minute or two. If you need to, you can just hop off screen for a second. I'm looking to see. I thought I saw, there she is. Dr. Brown came in. Hi there. I'm going to make you a co-host. So let me do an introduction for Dr. Brown. There you go. Not that I don't know you very well. So to start, Dr. Brown is really the person who supported the development of this program and helped with all of the grant writing, and really was an advocate to make sure that this was going here at URI. So without her, we would not be in this class. And so thank you to Dr. Brown. She is the department chair for plant sciences and entomology here at URI. She has an MS in plant breeding and a PhD in horticulture from the University of Minnesota. She teaches veg crop production, greenhouse and hydroponic vegetable production, and plant biology. I think that's all of them. And she conducts vegetable crop research and works for the Cooperative Extension, among many other hats that she wears. She also, I know, has done some work with cover crops too. So is she still here? Oh, there you are. Okay, you moved. So today she's going to be talking about crop planning. And I wanted to mention this before, but I'm really excited for this new like portion of our classes because we were talking about all the business and marketing things, but this is like farming. We're into farming now. So yeah, Dr. Brown, if you want to take it away.
Okay, thank you, Trish. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and share my screen and we can start talking about crop planning. And, feel free to interrupt and ask questions as you have them. We can really just have a conversation about this.
Looks good.
Okay. Yeah, so Trish asked me to talk to you about crop planning. I'm going to start out, though, with a bit of disclaimer, which is that I have never actually farmed commercially. All of my farming experience has been on research farms. So a lot of this is actually culled from various references more than speaking from personal experience on how to get things to fit together and nick so that you have a consistent season-long supply of every crop that you're trying to grow. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about, this is the outline. So we're going to start out by talking about what a crop plan is and why you would want to have one. And then we'll go into some of the details and some of the resources that you can use. And just to orient you, this is actually a picture of the teaching garden at URI that Trish and I do. It's about a ½ acre and is timed for fall harvest of all of our crops. My computer is being annoying. Okay, so a crop plan is simply a combination of a calendar, a map, and a production record. And it's basically a system that you develop for your farm to track when you plant, where you plant, how much each planting yields, and what your sales are like. And this will help you over the years to gather the data specific to your farm and make decisions. So your crop plan needs to include when, where, and how much you plant. So for each crop on your farm, for each field or bed, you want to know, when do you need to plant that? Where is it going to go and how much you're going to put there? Then you want to keep track of your harvests, how much you sell and the price you're selling at, so that you can calculate the profitability, both of your different crops and your different markets. And then it's a good idea to also keep track of all of your inputs of materials, so that you know what you applied. Part of this gets back to what Sarah was talking about, keeping track of what goes into each field. But also just keeping track of what you buy each year, how much you use, how much you have left over, which can save you a lot of time the following year. And then keeping track of labor is important too, particularly in market vegetable farming, where we're growing a lot of different crops and we're not necessarily highly mechanized. Labor can be 50% or more of the cost of production. And so if you know how much each crop costs you in terms of time to grow, then you can make decisions about profitability, but you can also then make decisions about potential labor saving practices based on actual economics. So for instance, if you're trying to decide whether to buy a new implement for your farm, you can figure out how much time is this going to save you, and how much is that time worth, and whether the new implement is actually going to make financial sense for you. So we'll talk a little bit about how to create a crop plan. So in any new farming enterprise, but particularly in direct retail growing of highly perishable products like fruits and vegetables, you want to start with your markets. You need to have a market, or preferably multiple markets, lined up for your harvest before you even plant. And this is in part because most of our crops are very difficult to store. And so you don't have time, once the harvest is ready or once you've harvested, to find that market or to wait for the price that you want, the way you might with a commodity crop that can be stored a long time. And of course, with the way we generally grow fruits and vegetables here in the Northeast, most of us are going to be growing for direct retail because that allows us to capture the largest portion of that retail dollar and thus offset the high costs of land and labor here. And so that means that marketing our crops is not simply a matter of signing a contract or having a handshake agreement with a wholesaler or a processor. It means, having a plan for a farmer's market booth, or developing a CSA and selling shares ahead, or having arrangements with chefs or multiple grocery stores to sell to them. So you need to figure out who your customers are. You need to figure out what they want, how much they want, and how much they will pay. And of course, you also have to ask, what do you want to grow? And part of what's so tricky about this is that there isn't a lot of available market research to answer these questions. You really have to just go out and talk to people. Go out and look around at farmers markets and see what other people are selling. And is there something that you think there's a market for that they're not selling, or something you think that you could produce better than they are? Go out and talk to supermarket produce managers, to restaurant chefs, to farm to school programs, whatever the various markets are in your area, and ask what they want and decide whether you can grow that in the quantity they want for the price they're going to pay and make a profit with it. Now, if you look at some of the resources out there on crop planning for diversified vegetable growers, such as the wonderful book and video series by Jean-Martin Fortier, The Market Grower or The Market Gardener, they'll say to start with your desired net income. In other words, how much do you need to make each year after expenses to meet your income goals? And that's very important. But the thing to realize is that the people who are saying that are usually people who have been growing for a very long period of time, and they already have their markets established. So in Jean-Martin's case, they have a CSA, and it's really about how many shares do they want to sell this year. They have a price for their shares. They know, because they've been in business for a long time and they have an established reputation, that they can sell as many shares as they might want to. If you're just starting out, you don't know this, right? And you need to figure out, both by doing market research and by just trial and error, how many shares can you sell? What will people in your area, in your location, pay for a share? That can vary widely. So in the beginning, you may actually need to start by looking at how much you can grow. In other words, how much space do you have? How much time do you have? How much money do you have for inputs? And see how much of that you can sell and how much you can bring in. And then tweak your plan based on those results so that each year you're getting a bit more profitable. However, when you are doing this, it can also be a very useful exercise to set an income goal. Assume that your net is going to be 50% of gross and figure out how much you would need to sell to make that goal. One of the challenges, though, is that until you actually start growing, it's very difficult to know what percent of your net is going to go to production costs, because every decision you make is going to affect that. And, so it really does need to be dialed in for your specific farm, your specific set of production practices, your specific set of equipment. Now, I don't know, because Trish didn't share the entire syllabus with me, how much you've talked about markets. And so if this isn't something you've covered, we can talk about it quite a bit more. But I just wanted to touch on the CSA because it's a very common market strategy for beginning market vegetable growers. Yeah,
Dr.
Trish?
Brown, we haven't talked about markets yet
Okay.
at all. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I will expand on this then. So I'll start with CSA. CSA is community supported agriculture. And they're very, very popular, particularly with beginning diversified market farms, but there are also some very long established market farms that use this use this method or this approach to marketing. And so what a CSA is basically a subscription farm. So you sell shares in your farm ahead of the growing season. And in return, your shareholders get a box of product each week during the season. And beyond that, CSAs can take all kinds of different forms. So there are CSAs that simply deliver boxes of produce each week. And that could be delivered to people's front doorstep, or it could be delivered to central pickup spots like a farmer's market, or say a large workplace, or natural food co-ops, just wherever people might gather. There are CSAs that have the shareholders come to the farm on a designated pickup day and allow them a semi-free choice of product. So the product available will be displayed like in a farmer's market, and people will be told, okay, you can have, up to this many bunches of greens, but you can choose which of the 5 types of greens we have, or you can have this many pounds of tomatoes, or this much sweet corn. There are CSAs that have a lot of newsletters and potluck nights and film nights and other social events. There are CSAs that have people provide farm labor as part of their share. And there are CSAs that never invite their shareholders to the farm. So it really depends on what you want to do as a farmer, what you're comfortable with, and what makes sense for your growers, or I'm sorry, for your shareholders. There are some real advantages to a CSA. One advantage is that you get the money up front, right? So people are paying for their shares ahead of the growing season, which means that you have money to buy inputs. and you have money to pay your workers and you don't have to borrow money. Another real advantage is that you can know the number of shares ahead of time, either because you've set a number of shares and you know that you can sell all of them, or because you've sold them already. And so you know how many you sold, right? And you also control what goes into the share. So you can map it out. So if you have, say, a CSA that runs for 22 weeks, you can map out ahead of time what you plan to put in the boxes each week. And you know how many shares you have. And so then you know how much you have to produce each week. And so this makes for very easy planning. Another nice thing about it is that when people buy a share in a community supported agriculture farm, they basically agree to take whatever you're able to produce. So if you have a cool, wet summer and you have lots of greens, but the cantaloupe crop is a complete failure, that's okay. You know, and you can adjust that way. The disadvantage of a CSA is that in general, your customers are going to want to expect to be able to get a very wide range of product. They may not only want the full range of vegetables that they might see at the local farmers market, but also herbs, cut flowers, eggs, small fruits and berries. And so you either need to grow all of that, or you need to arrange with other farmers who are producing it to bring that in, to buy that in, to add to your share. This can be a lot of fun, of course, but it also can be very challenging because it's a steep learning curve and you're trying to manage a very large number of different crops all at once. And of course, you still need to dial in your share number, your share size, and your share price to meet the goal. If you produce way more than you expected, and you give all of that to your shareholders, they'll probably be very happy, but you may not make a profit because what you sold your shares for doesn't cover the cost of all that production. If you set your share price too high and you under-deliver, what's going to happen is that your shareholders won't renew for the next season. So you do have to dial it in. So since you haven't talked about markets at all, I'm going to expand on this second slide a lot, which is the local retail approach. So local retail can be anything from a farm stand at the end of your driveway with an honor system, to a booth at the farmer's market or at multiple farmers markets, to selling to local chefs, to local grocery stores, to local schools and institutions, or even to local food hubs, if you have any in your area. The advantage of local retail as a beginning grower is that you don't have to sell everything, right? You could start out, if you look around at the markets in your area and what other people are growing, and you notice that, say, no one is growing basil, and you think you can grow basil really well, you could focus on just basil, or you could focus on just 5 or 10 crops. Some of the biggest vegetable farmers here in Rhode Island who sell a lot of their product to restaurants, institutions, supermarkets, only produce 5 or 6 different crops. And that is like, you know, that they've got close to 400 acres, and probably 80 to 90% of that production is 5 or 6 different crops. And they've just focused on getting really good at growing those, rather than trying to grow a whole bunch of other things. The big disadvantage of local retail is that, you know, say you're growing for the farmer's market and you've arranged to have a booth and you've planned out your production, and then you have a market day where it's absolutely pouring and nobody comes to the market. Well, now you've got all of this product and you haven't sold it. So it can be harder to predict sales, and it's more necessary to have backup markets if you're doing local retail than if you're doing a CSA system. So why don't I stop there and let folks ask questions about marketing, since I don't know what you don't know? So anybody got any questions?
I have a question, Dr. Brown.
Sure.
So for CSAs, you had mentioned that customers are usually willing to accept whatever product that you have available, depending on weather conditions or whatever, growing conditions. Is that a clause? Is it that they sign a contract that says that? Or is it just known?
I would certainly, if I were running a CSA, spell that out in the share agreement. But it's a very standard practice. You know, basically with a CSA, the shareholders are sharing the risk with the farmer. And so you usually want to make it clear to your shareholders that, you know, you're going to do your best job to produce, but there are factors that you can't control. And experienced shareholders know this. But if they're new to the CSA game, they may not know enough about agriculture to know this. So you would want to spell it out. So there is a certain amount of education going on. Okay, other questions?
I had a question.
Yeah.
We're in a pretty touristic area, and I'm trying to figure out, because I don't think a CSA would work because the year-round population here is really low. But I was thinking about like sort of CSA that are mini CSAs that are like week-long boxes or something, like people who come here to rent a house for like a week, like they could set up, have their vegetables or something like that. I don't know if you've ever heard of models like this or something like that in terms of.
I haven't heard of one like that, but it could possibly work. It really would depend, I would say, on whether your tourists tend to be like the same people year after year, or if it's constantly, you know, new people and how far they're planning ahead. You know, the other thing is, if you're a really touristic area, that's where, you know, first of all, selling to chefs, because you may have a lot of high-end restaurants that these summer people are going to. But also, either if there's a farmer's market that's timed for whatever day people tend to arrive, if they're renting by the week, or some way that you could have like a farm stand that was open you know, because summer people often, again, you know, if they're tourists, they're looking for activities. And so that's where thinking about the agritourism side, where you could have them come and have, you know, some sort of an experience, might be something to look into.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I would, Michael, also, you know how when you rent an Airbnb and they have kind of brochures out of like activities to do and things like that, like making sure there's like a flyer or some kind of advertisement there in the rental that they can see that where they can order in, you know, like have something like no need to grocery shop. We'll deliver your vegetables to you, something like that. You know what I mean? Because sometimes when you rent an Airbnb, you don't know where the stores are and things like that. Then we're like, oh, that's easy. So
Yeah, that's a good.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you could definitely do something like that. You know, and you could even set it up, you know, depending on how you wanted to do it, as sort of like a CSA where you had like a set box of vegetables that people could order.
Hey, Professor Brown, a question
Yeah.
for you around distribution. So if you're looking to tackle a certain market, but you don't want to be the transport element of attacking that market, are there some interesting distribution models? I don't know, through consortia, or something else that just keeps the farmer off the road.
Yeah, there actually are. So here in Rhode Island, we actually have a very innovative food hub, Farm Fresh Rhode Island. And a number of years ago, they implemented a program they call Market Mobile, which was designed for just that. And so basically, it's a computerized web-based interface where a farmer can go on and post what they have for sale each week. And chefs can go on and place orders. And then the Market Mobile team will either pick up produce from farmers or allow farmers to deliver to a single drop-off point. And then they will take all the produce from the different farmers. And so maybe drop-off day is Tuesday, right? And they'll take everything in, and then they'll repackage into deliveries for the chefs. And so then maybe delivery day for the chefs is Wednesday. They go to all of the restaurants. Each chef gets a single delivery from all the farmers that they've ordered from. And the Market Mobile team also handles billing the chefs and then paying the farmers. And they take a 10% cut off the top to fund this service. During the pandemic, they actually switched and started doing home delivery. And I believe now they have a semi-hybrid model where they're back, of course, to doing delivery to restaurants and institutions, but they also have home delivery up in the Providence area. So that sort of thing can definitely help. There are other models in other locations. So for instance, I know up in the Champlain Valley in Vermont, there are a lot of farmers who sell down into the New York City green markets, and they will share transportation down into New York. So that, you know, like they'll like hire a truck and fill it up and send it down. So there are things like that. There are other arrangements like the large grower in Rhode Island that I mentioned. They're so large that they actually sell to the wholesale market in Boston. And so they partnered with a locally owned grocery store. And the truck goes up to that market full of the farmer's vegetables that are going to be sold and comes back full of the produce that the grocery store bought, so that it doesn't make half the trip empty and they both save money. So it's really a question of whether some sort of cooperative program exists in your area, and if it doesn't, whether you can arrange some way to create one.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, other questions? Okay, so then we'll move on. Okay, so the thing to remember about crop planning is that it is a recursive or repetitive system. Basically, you're going to plan, then you're going to plant, you're going to harvest, you're going to sell, and you're going to use your records to evaluate the year that you just completed and plan the next one. When you're starting out, of course, you have to start with best guesses and approximations. And if you look in various books on how to successfully run a market farm, they generally have tables of information based on the author's experiences that you can use as a starting point for these best guesses and approximations. But it's very important to record your inputs and your results, and then you can use that to adjust your plan for the next season. And ideally, each year, your actual results at the end of the season should come closer to what you had planned. Okay. Although, of course, farming is always full of factors that you can't control. So it's one of these things where you try to control as much as you can, and then you build in resiliency of different markets, different crops to manage the risk factors that you can't control. So why do you want to do crop planning rather than just winging it? The primary reason is so that you can calculate your costs and your profits. If you don't have plans and records, you really have no way of determining how profitable your system is, because you don't have a good sense of what your overhead costs are and what you could adjust. So a large part of this, because labor is so much of a market farming enterprise, is actually tracking the person hours that go into everything. And this can seem really fiddly, and it is a fair amount of work, although you can make it easier with like a smartphone or a daily journal or something. But it's absolutely essential for determining what your true cost of production is. And even if you aren't actually paying yourself, even if your labor is provided by family members or volunteers, or you're doing it all yourself, it's a good idea to decide what your labor is worth and have that number in your profitability calculation, even if you never actually pay yourself. It just gives you a way to figure out your true costs of operation. Okay. One of the interesting things that's come out of some of the studies that Pasa has done is that they did a multi-year deep dive into diversified vegetable farm profitability. And they found that the majority of farms of all sizes were not actually making enough to pay the owner what they considered to be a living wage. So that's one reason why it's important to keep track of that, is so that you can, if you're in this for the long haul, try to get as close to that as you can. Tracking yields also allows you to adjust your production to meet market needs while minimizing excess. You want to have enough so that your customers aren't disappointed, right? But you don't want to have a whole bunch of excess that you wind up donating or feeding to the chickens or putting back into the ground, just because that's very expensive, right? All of the labor that you put into growing that crop, you're not getting a return on that. Okay. Tracking sales allows you to decide which customers or markets to cultivate or drop. So this gets into the distribution side again. If you have only 2 or 3 large customers, that's a more efficient distribution system than if you have 2 or 3 large customers and 15 much smaller ones. So you may want to decide that you need to drop some of those smaller customers, or maybe you need to just change the way you distribute to them. Like, for instance, could you have them come to a single pickup point, right, to get their product? So sort of like your own market mobile thing. Or could you have one of your large customers, would they maybe have the capacity to also act as a bit of a wholesaler and redistribute to the smaller customers? Tracking your sales lets you decide how to make these decisions because you have data. Tracking all of your purchased inputs allows you to both avoid shortages and waste. If you keep track of the fact that, for instance, you ran out of drip tape in August last year, then you know that this year maybe you need to buy 1 more roll of drip tape, right? Or if you keep track of the fact that you had a roll left over, then you know to adjust your purchasing for this year. And for things like fertilizers, pesticides, organic matter that you might have purchased in, keeping a list of what you bought and who you bought it from helps not only with planning, but if you're going for organic certification, your certifier is going to want to see this. Okay, so you may want to get yourself in the habit, for instance, of before you put a product on a field, taking a picture of that product that includes the label. And making a note that I put this on this field at this rate on this date. And then you have that record and you can go back later at the end of the day, the end of the week, the end of the growing season, and put that into your permanent record system. But basically, keeping track of everything, especially as you first get going, can be extremely helpful, because in the thick of things, you don't necessarily know what piece of information is going to be useful down the road. And so the more information that you can collect, then you've got that information, particularly if you can use a very low labor requirement for keeping track of it. If you know the input costs, the labor requirement, the yield, and the average sale price, you can determine the profitability of each crop for your farm. And if you look in Jean-Martin Fortier's books or his videos on YouTube, he actually has a chart where he has broken down the profitability for every single crop on his farm. And then he ranks them all from the most profitable to the least profitable. Now, if a crop is very low profit for you, you might decide you don't want to grow it. Maybe it actually makes more sense to buy that crop in from another grower who maybe is larger or more specialized. So for instance, a lot of CSAs here in Southern Rhode Island, rather than growing their own potatoes, will buy potatoes in from our larger potato farmers who are growing 30 or 50 or 100 acres of potatoes and have the equipment to plant and hill and harvest and grade their potato crop with machinery rather than having to do it by hand. Why? Because potatoes are a fairly low profit crop. And so it's a lot more cost effective to grow them if they're mechanized. And because up until the 1980s, potatoes were a major crop here in Southern Rhode Island, we still have a fair number of farmers who have that equipment. And, they inherited that equipment from their grandparents in some cases. And so they have the machinery without having a lot of money tied up in it. You may decide that a low profit crop is still important to grow because it's an important crop to your customers. An example of that is that many of the farms in New England that run farm stands grow sweet corn. Why? Because sweet corn is the crop that brings their customers to the farm stand, right? People are coming to the farm stand to get locally grown sweet corn. Sweet corn is a notoriously low profit crop because it's very space inefficient. Very large plants, very low yield per plant. But they continue to grow this crop even if they're only breaking even or they're losing money, because once they get the customer to the farm stand, the customer is also buying the higher profit crops like lettuce and tomatoes and strawberries and blueberries and things like that. There are basically two approaches to having a profitable farm. One is the commodity approach, which is a certain extent what I was talking about with the potatoes, where you look to maximize your yield per acre and your yield per person hour. And so this is usually going to require mechanization. And in general, these farms are growing very few crops, right? They're highly specialized. The other approach, which is what we tend to do in local agriculture and particularly in market gardening, is that you grow a diversity of crops, but you prioritize the production of those crops which are most profitable to you. So for instance, if high tunnel tomatoes are your most profitable crop, which is very common, you might choose that to be the crop that you grow to sell to local grocery stores. Or if somebody else has already cornered the market on high tunnel tomatoes, maybe your most profitable crop is going to be lettuce, or it's going to be cucumbers, or it's going to be pumpkins. And what you want to do is get really good at growing that crop and prioritize production of that, then also grow the crops that are less profitable but still profitable, and really question whether you need to grow the ones that you lose money on. And the take home on this is that you really need to be able to use your records to figure out how profitable each crop is for you. And you may even want to break that down to each variety of each crop when you make your decisions about what varieties to keep growing and how much of each variety to grow. So what are some of the data sources to start with? Where to find this sort of thing? So one excellent, although somewhat dated source for costs of production is the Organic Farmer's Business Handbook by Richard Wiswall. And this is available both from Chelsea Green and also from Growing for Market. Basically, Richard Wiswall went from being a market farmer to being a market farm business educator. And as part of that process, he took about 25 years of crop plans and records for his farm and used them to make extremely detailed crop enterprise budgets for each crop on his farm. And one of the things that's unique about his budgets is that they're scaled for the market farm. So instead of calculating everything on a per acre basis, he calculates everything on a 20th of an acre. His book is somewhat out of date, so the actual costs of things will have changed. But where it's extremely useful is that he kept detailed records of the person hours required to do each task. And he also kept good records of his yields. And as part of his book, he includes a CD that has all of the spreadsheets that he developed as Excel files on the CD so that you can actually put them on a computer and put your own numbers in and use it as a starting point for developing your own farm records. And he explains how he calculated each number. So you can use that to figure out how to calculate your own. If you don't want to take such a deep dive and you just want somebody else's numbers on, you know, how much to plant to get this yield or how profitable this crop is, there are charts both in Jean-Martin Fortier's The Market Gardener, and also in Market Farming Success, as well as in other books. And there are a lot of enterprise budgets available for different crops that have been developed by cooperative extension programs all over the country. And these can be useful for local information, but most of them assume large-scale mechanized production. They're going to give you the costs and the yields on a per acre basis. Now, how do you figure out how much a crop is going to yield? Right? So you know, say that you can sell 300 pounds of tomatoes a week to your customers during the tomato season. How many tomato plants do you need to get 300 pounds of tomatoes a week? There are charts, again, in the Market Gardener, in Market Farming Success, and in other books. There are annual yield reports for vegetables that are published by the USDA. I gave you the link here for the New England report, which includes all 5 states in New England, as well as a New England average. And another source that can be really useful is university variety trial reports. Because when we do variety trials, we will report the yield for each variety. Depending on the type of trial, the yield may be reported by the acre, it may be reported by the plot, or it may be reported by the individual plant. For sales prices, these are the hardest ones to get because New England does not do a good job of tracking local retail vegetable and fruit prices. So we track what's at the wholesale market, but we don't track farmers market, farm stand, CSA, that sort of thing. There are other regions of the country that do, and those reports are actually available online for free from the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. The USDA National Ag Statistics Service annual reports do give the average price per pound or per 100 pounds for the different vegetable crops for New England. But that price is a combination of wholesale and retail. So it tends to be lower than what you would get, say, at farmers market. And really, the best way to set your prices may be to simply scout the competition. Okay, go to some of the farmers markets, for instance, and see what other people at other markets are selling for. Go to the supermarkets that your customers would be shopping at if they weren't buying from you, and see what the supermarket is charging. You know, basically get a sense that way. Are there questions about any of this so far? Trish?
Dr. Brown, you didn't mention the Johnny's website.
Okay, yeah, so the Johnny's website and seed catalogs in general can be a good place to get yield information. It really depends on how local the seed catalog is to where you're growing. And also whether you are planting at a similar planting density. Johnny's is amazing because their website has far more information than anybody else's. And they do have a large amount of information. Another good resource, particularly if you're very table oriented, is this book. And I don't know if you can see that. It's Knott's Handbook for Vegetable Growers. The 6th edition just came out last year. And this 6th edition is edited in part by Becky Seidman, who is the vegetable cooperative extension person for UNH. It's basically a book of charts that has all kinds of information in it. Plant spacings, typical yields, temperature tolerances, nutrient needs, how many pounds in a bushel for different crops, all kinds of information. It's moderately pricey. It's about $80. But you're the sort of person who likes to have a chart to look things up in, it can be very useful. Other questions? Okay, I'll keep going then. So, it's very important with all of this information that you're gathering and with all the different crops that you'll be growing to stay organized. And this is the other reason for having a crop plan. Because of course, in the market garden, unlike in commodity agriculture or even larger scale wholesale vegetable production, you are trying to extend your production season for every crop in both directions. So you want to be the first one to market with your crop, and you want to make sure that your customers have that crop available for as long as possible. Because, the average American now is accustomed to the supermarket where everything is available all the time. And while we can't completely duplicate that with local agriculture, we need to come as close as possible. But that means that you're going to be both planting and harvesting all of these different crops all season. And that can get really, really complicated. So this is where a calendar with dates for seeding, transplanting, and beginning and end of harvest for each planting of each crop can be absolutely essential, because then you know on each day what you need to do. Also, if you know when to expect harvest of each crop to start and stop, you're able to plan your sales, right? You know what you should be harvesting each week. You're able to plan your successions, and you're able to plan planting of your cover crops, because you know when you're going to be taking the last vegetable crop out of a particular bed. And so when you can put cover crop into that bed. At the same time, having a garden plot map where you've mapped out over the season what is going to go in each bed, in each field, and when it's going to be there, allows you to efficiently use your space. It allows you to avoid negative interactions between crops, like, for instance, following a boron-sensitive crop like lettuce or snap beans, putting that in a bed where the previous crop was, say, beets or broccoli, where you had to put supplemental boron fertilizer. Because if you do that, you could wind up with boron toxicity and thus stunting and crop failure on your sensitive crop. Or, for instance, planting a fall planting of something that needs a lot of sun on the north side of, say, your sweet corn, and having the sweet corn shade out your fall planting. Now, you could do that deliberately, but you don't want to do that accidentally, or because you didn't plan enough and now the only empty space is that one to the north of the sweet corn. Also, if you're not the only one who's doing the farming on your farm, having a detailed plot map makes sure that your employees or your volunteers, when you tell them, go harvest the lettuce, they know where that lettuce is, and they don't accidentally harvest the arugula because they don't know the difference. Or they don't harvest the wrong planting because they don't know the difference. One thing that Jean-Martin Fortier emphasizes in his videos, and I agree with him completely on, is that planning ahead minimizes the amount of decisions you have to make during the growing season. And since the growing season tends to be a period of lots of distractions, lots of stress, and maybe not enough sleep, to the extent that you can avoid making decisions, then you're going to be happier and better off. Okay. Also, every year is different. So in addition to having a calendar with your planned dates for everything, you want to go in and also put the actual dates that everything happened in your calendar, so that way you know if, for instance, it was a warm summer and everything matured early, or it was a cold summer and the harvest was late, or it was a wet summer and you wound up planting late. It can be just a way to help you keep your records and plan for the next year. Now, what are some data sources to start with in making your plan? So when it comes to timing your planting and predicting when harvest is going to begin, seed catalogs include days to maturity information. Depending on the vendor, all of the information may be on their website, or you may need to look at the paper catalog. Okay. There are charts in the Market Gardener and other books, but remember that time from planting to maturity is very dependent on your location and on the season. Also, another shout out to Johnny's. They have wonderful planting date calendars on their website that allow you to, for instance, enter your harvest date and calculate back from that. Or for fall plantings, enter your average first frost and calculate back from that. For creating your garden plot plan, you can get recommended plant spacings from seed catalogs, from the Knott's Handbook, and also from the New England Vegetable Management Guide. And you can do everything by hand on paper if that's your preferred mode. But there's also a lot of market garden planning software out there now. I've never used the various different packages. I admit that I'm still more or less planning on paper and also not planning as much as I should, as Trish will tell you. But part of that's because I'm not actually running a commercial enterprise. But most of the software packages that are out there either have a free trial or they have a free limited version. So you can try the packages out for free, find one that you like the interface of and that you think will work for you. And then if you need the additional features of the paid version, you can decide whether that's something you want to invest in. And you can certainly do your garden planting plan, with a spreadsheet or on paper, if that works for you also. Okay, so that is really all I have specifically about plans. The rest of the talk, I was going to look at how you determine the time from planting to harvest, and also talk some about succession planting. So are there any questions about this before we move on? And do people need a break? All right. I'm not hearing anything. So I guess we'll move on. So how do you determine how long it's going to take from when you plant to when the plants will be ready to transplant, or from when you transplant to when things are going to be ready to harvest? And this is important because every year is different and every season is different. Your goal is to have a continuous supply for as much of the year as possible. So as I mentioned before, this means that you're probably going to be using practices like starting transplants and growing under row covers or in high tunnels to get an earlier harvest. And you're also probably going to be using practices such as succession cropping and row covers and high tunnels to get a later harvest at the end of the season. So in order to make all of this work, for each crop, you need to know the following. What is the earliest you can plant this crop? How long from planting to first harvest? How long is the harvest period? And then what is the latest the crop can be harvested? And this would be both for each planting of the crop, but also for succession plantings. In other words, when does it get too late to do additional succession plantings? So how do you know when is the earliest that a crop can be planted? This is actually primarily determined by air and soil temperatures. So here we're talking about planting or transplanting outside. Okay. With spring and summer crops, you really need to wait until the air and soil have warmed to at least the minimum temperature for that crop. And you can find out the minimum temperatures from sources such as the Johnny's website, and also from the charts in things like the Knott's Handbook or the New England Vegetable Production Guide. You can artificially increase temperatures using things like plastic mulch and row covers to create a warmer microclimate. But there's really no point in planting crops out into the field while it's still too cold for them. With fall and winter crops, we actually have the opposite problem, which is that most of our fall and winter crops need to be planted during the summer. And so we may need to wait until the soil or the air gets cool enough that these crops can grow. If you plant them too soon, it's going to be too hot and you're not going to get good performance. Now, for many crops, in fact, I would say in the market garden, most crops, you can get a jump on the season by starting transplants. And one of the advantages of this is that your transplants can be put in an environment where the temperatures are within that optimal zone for the crop, even if the field temperatures are not there. So for instance, in the spring, we would start our crops in a heated greenhouse, right? So it's too cold to put tomatoes in the open field here in Rhode Island until sometime in May. But we could start our tomato transplants in a heated greenhouse in March or April. Similarly, it's too hot in the field to get good growth of, say, fall broccoli in July. But we could start our fall broccoli crop as transplants in a shaded screen house or in the shade under some trees where it's cooler, and get those plants going so that when it does finally cool down, we can transplant them into the field and they've already got 4 or 6 or 8 weeks of growth. Okay. If you're going to do this though, you do need to pay attention to the recommended transplant sizes for each vegetable, because if you let your transplants get over mature, particularly if you also let them get nutrient stressed, that can permanently stunt them and they may yield poorly. So for instance, with those tomatoes going into the field in May, you may think, well, I'm going to get an earlier harvest by growing my tomato transplants and potting them up into, say, gallon containers and letting them actually flower in the greenhouse before I put them in the field. But actually, you would lose yield that way, because when you transplant tomatoes that are already flowering, it stresses them. And that will delay the set or the development of future flowers while they're likely to drop those first flowers or fruits. And tomatoes are very resilient to transplanting. Other crops might be a lot more susceptible. So for instance, a lot of your cucurbit crops, your melons, your squash, your cucumbers, if they have more than 2 or 3 true leaves, they really do not like to be transplanted. So you're going to want to only start the seeds in the greenhouse about 3 weeks ahead of when you expect to be able to plant them in the field so that they don't get too big. And remember that you may also be able to either direct seed into the field or transplant into the field sooner by using row covers or tunnels to protect from extreme temperatures. So for instance, here in Rhode Island, we have growers who will transplant their tomatoes into their high tunnels in mid-April and use floating row covers in those high tunnels to protect from cold night temperatures and take advantage of the fact that on a sunny day, it might be 45 outside, but it'll be 75 or 80 in the high tunnel. And so the tomatoes will grow perfectly happily. Whereas at 45 or 50 degrees, your tomato plants won't freeze, but they also won't grow because it's too cold for them. Okay. So how do you figure out how long from planting to first harvest? Well, seed catalogs are going to tell you the days to maturity for each variety. And this is generally the days from seeding, unless the crop is usually transplanted. So for instance, with tomatoes, it's going to be the days from transplanting. Some catalogs, such as the Johnny's website, if you look in the growing information for that crop, they will tell you how many days to add or subtract to get from seeding to transplanting or transplanting to seeding. The thing to remember about the days to maturity is that these are calendar days during the normal growing season for that crop. And they can vary a lot. So for instance, if you were to look at the same variety and look at the days to maturity in the Johnny's catalog, in the Osborne Seeds catalog, which comes out of Western Washington State, and in a catalog from, say, some regional grower in the Southeast, they might have different days to maturity for the same variety. Why? Because in their climate and their typical growing season for that crop, the temperatures are different and the day length may be different. And that's going to change the days to maturity. So where the days to maturity in the catalog is most useful is if you're trying to compare different varieties. So say you're planning to grow melons, cantaloupes, and you want to make sure that you have cantaloupes for your customers for as long as possible during the summer. You might want to grow 3 or 4 different varieties with different days to maturity, so that you have an early variety that you harvest for a week. And then you have another variety that you harvest for the next week, and another variety that you harvest for the third week, and then a late variety that you harvest for the last week, all from a single planting date. Year to year, the relative spacing between those varieties should be fairly consistent. In other words, the earliest variety is always going to come in first. The latest variety is always going to come in last. but the actual days is going to vary. You'll get the same thing if, for instance, you're trying to do an early season planting or a late season planting. The early variety will come in first, the late variety will come in last, but the days to maturity may vary. And this is because the plants don't know how to read a calendar. Okay? So your plants are not counting calendar days. Instead, your plants are responding to temperatures, light, and the presence or absence of stress. Okay? As a general rule of thumb, for early spring plantings and for late fall harvests, you want to add 14 days to the days to maturity in the catalog to account for slower growth. And this is because plants grow a lot more slowly in March and April than they do in May or June. And similarly, they grow more slowly in September and October than they do earlier in the season. Okay. If you're trying to plant in the fall for winter harvest in a high tunnel, or even in a greenhouse where you have heat but no supplemental lighting, you want to substitute your last day in the fall that you have 10 hours of daylight for your harvest date. Because once the daylight drops below 10 hours, your plants aren't actually going to grow anymore. They'll stay alive if they don't freeze, but they won't get any bigger. So they need to be at harvestable size at that last 10-hour day. Okay. So plant growth rate, as I mentioned, is primarily determined by temperature and light. The availability of water and nutrients is a secondary determinant. So this is really important if you're growing transplants. Failure to keep your transplants watered or failure to provide enough nutrients can really slow the growth down, even if you have the right temperature and plenty of light. Each plant species has an optimal temperature range, and growth is going to slow or stop outside the range. So it's useful to know what that range is for your different vegetables, and be able to plan on that. The other thing to remember is that plants need at least 10 megajoules of solar radiation per meter squared per day, which is approximately 10 hours a day of sunlight for vegetative growth to occur. This gets back to that knowing when your last 10-hour day is. Here in Rhode Island, our last 10-hour day is roughly Veterans Day. Our first 10-hour day in the spring is roughly Valentine's Day. Between Veterans Day and Valentine's Day, vegetables basically won't grow, even in a heated greenhouse, without supplemental light. Okay. So part of what that means is that if you are planning your spring planting, you may not gain much by planting in February over planting in early March. simply because there won't be that much plant growth during February because there's not a lot of light. Okay, it also means that while you can fill a high tunnel with spinach that's ready to harvest on Veterans Day and continue to harvest that spinach throughout much of the winter, any spinach that you would then seed in to replace what you've harvested isn't really going to grow much until you get past Valentine's Day and you get some more light. Okay. So this just gives you some data to illustrate that. So these curves are for Kingston, Rhode Island, because that's where I'm located. And they're a little bit out of date now, but it still shows you the basic idea. So if you look at our 30-year mean temperature, you can see that it's pretty much a symmetrical curve, right? So temperatures in February are fairly similar to temperatures in November. Temperatures in April are fairly similar to temperatures in October. Or I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong curve. So the yellow-green curve is the daylight curve, which is absolutely symmetrical. The temperature curve, on the other hand, is not symmetrical. So it's colder in the spring than it is in the fall. Okay. In the fall, we can grow outdoors despite the declining daylight all the way up until our 10-hour day in November, because the warm temperatures help to compensate. In the spring, however, even with the daylight, unless we can increase the air and soil temperature, we're not going to get a lot of growth. And this is where transplant production in a greenhouse without lights or growing in a high tunnel can really help you in the spring, because it allows you to take advantage of all of this light that we have in March and April when our temperatures are still low. This graph over here shows you the average solar radiation from 1961 to 1990, and it really hasn't changed much since then. But it also shows you the data for 2014. And what I'm showing that for is to show you that while the average solar radiation at a specific location changes consistently from month to month. In other words, the average, whether you took the 1961 to the 1990 or the 1980 to the 2010 or the 2000 to the 2020, it's going to look fairly similar. But the year-to-year variation can be significant. So for instance, in 2014, we had a warm, cloudy winter. And so that meant that our solar radiation was below the minimum for vegetative growth from, sometime in October all the way through February. In an average year, we might have been able to go into November before we ran out of light. And maybe it was the 1st of February rather than the 14th when we got enough light. The other thing that this shows is, so the red bar is that 10 hours or 10 megajoules per meter squared per day. The yellow dashed bar is 13 megajoules per meter squared per day. And that's the minimum for a lot of heat-loving crops like tomatoes. And so part of what this shows you is that if you don't have supplemental light, if you're trying to grow a crop like tomatoes or peppers or eggplant in the greenhouse over the winter, even with heat, you're not going to get much growth between October and February because there is simply not enough light. So does that make sense to folks? Yeah. Questions about that?
I have a related question.
Yeah.
I know there's a new USDA plant zone map,
Mhm.
and it you can use that to get your like first frost and last frost date, but now it's new. So how does that affect our plantings crop plan for this year?
So the hardiness date map, the zone map, remember that USDA hardiness zone is actually determined by the average extreme minimum temperature over the winter over the preceding 30 years. So in other words, how cold was the coldest night of the winter over the past 30 years? It doesn't actually tell you what your first and last frost dates are. Now, it is true that there is some correlation, right? So the colder your winter gets, in general, it's also going to start earlier and later. But that depends on where you are. And so one of the beauties of being particularly in coastal New England is that while overall our temperatures have been getting warmer and our hardiness zone has increased, the volatility of our fall and spring weather, and particularly our spring weather, has also increased. So it makes it really hard. In general, here in Rhode Island, I think our first fall frost has been getting later, but we need to be on the lookout and have the row covers ready for unexpected early radiative frost events. Like you may remember, Trish, that 2 years ago, we had a frost, what was it, September 24th or something, which is like ridiculously early for us. And it wasn't even in the forecast. It caught us completely by surprise. And the same thing is true with your last spring frost. I mean, the way this spring has been going, we may be frost free already. But then again, we could get a frost on May 15th. So I would say that if you don't have a good way to quickly protect from frost, you don't want to push your first and last. The other thing to remember is that for most of our frost sensitive crops, they also are warm weather crops. And so maybe we're frost free now, right? But it's still not warm enough to put my tomatoes outside. Because even if they don't freeze, it's only 45 to 50 degrees most days, and they're not going to be happy at 45 to 50 degrees. And I'll get much better results if I wait until the highs are consistently closer to 70, and the night temperatures are consistently above 50 before I put them out. So it really depends on your location and how quickly your climate goes from winter to summer. So here in coastal Rhode Island, we have a fairly long spring and a very long fall. But for instance, if you're in, say, Vermont or New York with a more continental climate, you may have a climate where you're like, yes, if spring happens on a weekend, we'll have a picnic, which is what we used to say in Minnesota. And there, planting out right after your last frost day might make a lot of sense because you go from cold to hot really, really quickly. So that's very location dependent. Other questions about that? Okay, let's keep going because we're getting a little short on time here. So what about seed germination and transplant production? So seed germination rate is driven by soil temperature. Okay, air temperature is not important except as it affects soil temperature. And remember that soil temperature changes a lot more slowly than air temperature. If your soil is either warmer or colder than optimum, this can greatly increase the time to emergence and lower your percent germination. And this change is pretty rapid. So at the ideal temperature, you might get germination and emergence in 5 to 7 days, where if your temperature is too warm or too cold, it could take 2 weeks or it could take never. This is particularly true for direct seeded crops. And the reason for that is that the longer a seed takes to germinate and emerge from the soil, the more time the insects and the microbes in that field soil have to eat that seed or eat the seedling. In a soilless mix, in a transplant production flat, you have more of a sterile environment, which can help to protect that seed while it takes a longer time to germinate. But this is one of the reasons why growers use either heated germination cabinets or heat mats to adjust the seed temperature under, the soil temperature in their transplant flats in the spring, so that they don't have to warm the whole greenhouse to the ideal temperature for seed germination. This is also true, also why when germinating cool season crops in the summer, you may actually get better results if you keep your transplant flats indoors .
Dr. Brown, I think you're frozen, Dr. Brown. I don't know if you can hear me. Oh, I lost a bunch of people.
Yeah, I thought that was me.
I know. I was looking for slight movements in all the cameras. Maybe she'll hop back on. Lost a couple. It's a lot of information. Is anyone getting some good stuff out of this? Hopefully.
Definitely.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think we lost a few people, Danielle. So, oh, I got a message. She lost the Zoom link. See if she pops back on. It wasn't just her.
I have spring broccoli because I planted my fall broccoli too late and it overwintered.
Oh,
So now that it got warm here in
yeah,
Maryland, like Sarah was saying, how we had like that 70-degree streak,
yeah,
the false spring, as I like to call it.
yeah.
It made all my broccoli plants form heads, and so I've been harvesting broccoli all week, which has been great, but
That's
Mike
awesome.
was making fun of me. Like, good thing you're gonna be a flower farmer and not a vegetable farmer.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I left my kale in. She can't, so Dr. Brown's not able to access the internet. It looked like she was at school. That was her office, so the campus might be having problems with Zoom. Um, she's gonna try another way to get in, but otherwise I'll probably just send those last couple of slides out. Oh yeah, so my kale overwintered and now I have kale. That's like just starting to grow. Yeah, her internet's totally down. So what we'll do is that's it. That was crop planning in a nutshell, and I'll get those last couple slides and share them. I'm still recording. And if you guys want to take like a 15-minute break and we'll come back for noon with our next presenter. Is that good? Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. I'll stick around in case anybody else pops in. Dr. Brown, I just excused everyone because I didn't think to hop back on. So if you want to send me the slides, I'll share them.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, unless there was something that you want to add.
No, that's fine. I
Okay.
can just send them to you.
Okay.
So, but I mean, I'm here if people have questions and they want to chat about anything.
No, they're good. That was a lot of
Okay.
information. Yeah. Thanks,
Yeah,
Dr. Brown from Christina.
Okay.
Yeah, and they had some good feedback. They said it was a lot of good information. So
Okay, good. Good.
I thought maybe the Zoom had gone down like it had done yesterday. I
Mm.
got those IT messages.
Yeah, I don't know. It seemed like the whole internet glitched.
Okay. Yeah, it wasn't just you that got kicked off, actually. It was like maybe 10 people.
Okay.
So yeah,
Yep.
and then Dr. Faubert or Heather Faubert's going to be on next.
Cool.
So
All right.
thank you.
Yep.
Your mic and say something. And we'll talk a bit about small fruit production. All right. Let's see. Oops, I need to share my screen. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit. I realized after or while I was putting together this talk that it sounds more like a why not to grow small fruit. So I just kind of want to warn people because so many times I encounter people that want to grow things and which is fantastic and great, and they think it's going to be easy. And it's not easy. It's not easy being a farmer. And I think growing fruit is kind of difficult. So if it seems too much like I'm trying to discourage you from growing small fruit, I'm sorry. Of course, it can be done, but there's just a lot of things to consider. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about those things rather than actually how to grow for some of them anyway. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to be talking about blueberries, more blueberries, and then a little bit more of about strawberries and raspberries and blackberries in particular. So there are lots of other small fruit, grapes. So grapes are if you're interested in growing grapes, it seems like grape growers, that is really all they do is grow grapes. And there's just a lot of particular things to know about growing grapes. So I'm not going to be talking about grapes. And then there's other things like currants and gooseberries and honeyberries and lots of other fruit that I'm really not going to address today. Okay. So I think growing small fruits does make a lot of sense. Usually you would get better prices at a farmer's market than you can get for vegetables. You see just this picture I took years ago at a farmer's market, and beautiful vegetables for sale, but not small fruit. So usually at a farmer's market, there might be just one or maybe two growers that's selling fruit, where there could be, you know, a dozen selling vegetables. So you really can do a good job selling your fruit. And then you could also make these value-added products such as jams or jellies or baked goods. And they always do well at farmers markets as well. And then also an extra benefit about being a fruit grower is in at least all the New England states, there's a very active farmer group, a grower group that meets regularly, and there's cooperative extension specialists that specialize in tree fruit and small fruit. And I think that that's a real bonus to growing fruit, where there are other vegetable organizations. In Rhode Island, there's not, though. In Rhode Island, we have a fruit growers organization and a nursery association, but that's really it for farmer groups. There is also Farm Bureau, but that's really pretty different. So what are some of the downsides about growing small fruit? Well, the initial investment is rather large. So for vegetables, you're buying seeds, or you're buying seeds, and the initial investment is quite a bit lower than buying plants and planting plants. And then also for several like raspberries and blackberries, you're going to want a support system. So you're going to need a trellis system. So that's expensive too. And for blueberries in particular, you're going to need bird protection, which is usually some kind of netting. So there's just all these upfront costs, and then you're not making any money in some case for at least a year. So strawberries, you can get a crop within a year, and I guess some raspberries you can, depending how you're growing things. But like for blueberries, it's going to be a couple of years before you get any fruit that you could sell, and probably 5 years before those bushes are into full production. So you can see you've got all this money that needs to go out and very little coming in. So that's a problem. It can be a problem. Also, with vegetables, you can rotate the crops. And Rebecca maybe talked about that, or somebody's talked to you about that. But rotating crops is very useful for not getting rid of, but trying to avoid insect pests and disease pathogens that would be in the soil or in plant debris. So with vegetables, you can do that. With an annual crop, you can do that. But with a perennial crop such as raspberry bushes or blueberry bushes, you can't rotate. So it does, it can make pest control a little bit more difficult. And then it also ties up your land for years. Or if you're renting land, a lot of farmers get into farming by renting land, and it's not always a good idea to be, putting in a bunch of money into somebody else's land, like planting trees or bushes. Also, the small fruits are very perishable. They really don't store well, so you don't have much time to sell the crops. Blueberries do better than, say, raspberries or strawberries, but they're still quite perishable, unless you can freeze them. And you really need to look into freezing, because just freezing them in your freezer, I don't think that's food safety wise. I don't think that that's legal. I'm not sure. I don't know what the rules are, but I remember hearing that really is something you shouldn't do. And then I always want people to think about, how are they going to sell their crop once they grow it? And this, of course, it refers to vegetables and to growing fruit. But how do you intend to sell? You really should know what your market is before you plant things. And also another one, do you like people? How would you feel if you do pick your own? How will you like people tromping around on your land, and do you like interacting with people at farmers markets? And then also you're going to need some help, especially if you're going to be doing markets. And who can you count on for help? Is there a family member, or are there a few family members that can help you? It's just some basic things to think about. Okay. There is some wonderful resources available, and I'm old, so I usually like things in a book kind of. I like to see things in print, but online there's great information. There's the New England Small Fruit Management Guide that's produced every other year, and it does have good, growing like pH requirements and planting distance and some variety information. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. But primarily what it has is how to manage insects and diseases and weeds. So that is a really good resource, this small fruit management guide. And then also for small fruit in particular, there's Norse Nurseries, which is in Massachusetts. So yay, we've got a local nursery that produces raspberries, blueberries, strawberry plants. And they've got a great planting guide that's online. And then I think also that they send it with every order every order that they sell and send out. And they have for each crop, they've got growing information. And it is great. And so I'm not going to go through like each crop saying you need to have this many feet between your plants or so many inches between your plants, because it's all easily available. Okay. So I do want to talk a little bit about blueberries. As I said, I am now going to tell you some specifics about blueberries because they are rather different than the other small fruits. And the main difference is the soil needs to be a really low pH of like 4.5 to 5.2, or even Norse says that 5.0 is too high. So you really need to have a very, very acidic soil. And for all the other crops, just potatoes, I guess, get grown also in a low pH, but all our other crops, we really usually keep the pH around 6.5 to 7, right around there. But when the pH of the soil is too high, blueberry plants can't pick up the nutrients. And so you need to have a low pH. Now, if you're clearing land, like clearing woods, and then want to grow blueberries, the regular pH of soil in our woods is right around 4.5, maybe even a little bit lower. I think a little bit lower than 4.5. But if you're wanting to so if you're clearing woods and putting in blueberry plants, you're probably in a pretty good situation to start with. But if you're planting blueberry plants into farmland, the pH is probably going to be too high, and you're going to want to reduce the pH. The way you reduce the pH is with applying sulfur. And you would want to add the sulfur in the fall before you would plant, and incorporate it, meaning to, you like rototill it into the soil several inches, 6 to 8 inches, because it doesn't move very well through the soil. And you want to do this, of course, before the planting. You don't want to go and buy plants, plant them, and then check the pH and see that you need to reduce the pH. You'll really have very unhealthy blueberry plants. I wanted to say that Norse Nursery recommends mixing wood chips in before planting, and that this helps aerate the soil and increases drainage of the soil, and allows easier root penetration so that the plants can grow more easily. Increasing drainage is so important. I don't know of any vegetables or fruit that grow well in really heavy or wet soils. If you have a wet area of a field, you probably just don't want to even plant in that area, or you want to make raised beds, do something so that you get good drainage. Because yeah, planting into a wet site is just asking for trouble. So this, I'm just showing this to show, this is from the small fruit guide, but it's just telling you like how much sulfur you would need to add. You know, like let's say your present soil is 6.5 pH and you want to, you know, reduce it to 4.5 or 5.0 pH. And then you have the different soil types. So this is telling you how much sulfur you would add, how many pounds per 100 square feet of sulfur you would need to add to the soil to bring the pH down. So that's available in the small fruit guide. Just, yeah, it's just important to know that if you're, yeah, you'll need to get the pH right. I think I've hammered that in enough. Okay. And then blueberries, you start with this pretty small plant. I'm happy to read that Norse Nurseries is now selling plants in, I think they said 1 liter pots. I'm sure it makes it more expensive, but I think that you get a much healthier plant and off to a better start with plants that are like rooted in the soil rather than like bare roots plants that are really pretty tiny. So yeah, I was happy to see that. But the plants are pretty small when you start, and you need to plant them far apart. It's like 4 to 5 feet between plants to give them, because in 5 years when they're mature size, they are going to be so much bigger. So it's just you just need to, even though it looks like ridiculously far apart, you need to not plant the plants too close to each other. You need to give them room. And then you want to give plenty of space between the rows. And just exactly how much, this is saying, I think that I got this from the Norse Nursery catalog, 8 to 12 feet between rows. And that's really going to depend on your equipment, whatever equipment you have or equipment that you, that you plan to get. And I must say that I see much too often that growers will plant rows too close together, whether it be, apple trees or blueberry bushes, that they tend to want to plant them closer together and kick themselves forward after, later. But you want to give yourself plenty of room. And then also not fertilizing right away, but waiting like 4 to 6 weeks after planting before fertilizing it all. And water, plants need water. And if you can set up drip irrigation, that's going to be that'll be the most water efficient and getting the water right where it needs to be. So setting up irrigation is a really good thing to do. I wanted to, so here back on this picture, you can see that these are raised beds, and then the grower's got black plastic over top to keep the weeds out. This is at an organic farm. And then here, these bushes also, of course, very mature, are also on raised beds and then using wood chips. And wood chips make a really nice mulch. There's problems with at the URI's blueberry patch. We use sawdust as a mulch, and it doesn't even do that good a job keeping the weeds out. But it's a great bed for insects to live in and rodents to tunnel through, where with wood chips, the voles that might be chewing on the roots of the plants or bothering the plants, when you have a wood chip as a mulch, the tunnels collapse. And so it really discourages rodents for setting up shop around your plants, whereas some other mulches, including that black plastic, can encourage voles and other problems, other rodent problems getting in there. So I do like the wood chips. And then the wood, mentioned
I have
about.
a question.
Yes, what's your question?
Is there any particular wood chip that you should avoid? Like pine or?
Yeah,
Just-
no, I don't think there's a problem. There could be a problem if you use something like black walnut wood chip. I don't know if anybody makes black walnut wood chips, but yeah, I haven't heard of any problem. But thank you. So yeah, so the wood chips, they're going to help, or any kind of mulch is going to help keep the moisture in, and then also help reduce weeds. And you can see here, this is a bindweed. That is a blueberry bush underneath all that bindweed. And you can see they've got wood chips for a mulch, and there's pretty good weed control around the bush, but these vines have grown up right through the middle of it. And I see this much more frequently than I'd like to see. So, I mean, you still need to hand weed, even if you're using herbicides, even if you've got mulch, you're going to need to get in and make sure that you keep the weeds out of the plants, because weeds are just going to compete for nutrients and moisture and just make plants a lot, the blueberry plants that you want, a lot weaker. The pruning, you need to prune the bushes every single year, and you really each of the branches there, or trunks, whatever you call them, they're called canes. And so you want to remove about a quarter of the canes each year, usually right around this time of year. Anytime before the buds really open up is a good time to do the pruning. And you're taking out about a quarter of usually the oldest, biggest canes. And what this does is helps produce more canes coming up from the soil, from the roots. And it's those younger canes that are going to be the most productive ones. So you really want to keep like putting life into the blueberry bushes. Blueberry bushes can live a very long time, and they can continue to be productive if you continue to prune them and stimulate new canes to be developed. Okay. And yeah, the young canes are the healthiest. And I did want to mention that sometimes people buy properties that have blueberry bushes already on them. And so I don't know if you can see here. So here's some blueberry bushes here. These plants here had gotten out of control. They had gotten too big, and the grower just came in here and did basal pruning, it's called, when you just cut out the whole thing. And blueberries are very good at rejuvenating themselves. So here, this was cut 1 year, and then I'm not sure how many years later this is, because these look pretty old, but probably 3 years later. But anyway, if you cut off the whole plant, that next spring, you would do the cutting in the wintertime, and in the springtime, you'll get a bunch of new shoots coming up, new canes. So blueberries can be very good at rejuvenating themselves. Now, if you do something like this, you won't get fruit for about 3 years. So you really set yourself back, but there's just some plants where it makes a lot of sense to do this, especially, yeah, some big old blueberry bushes and that really aren't productive. And you do something like this, and in a few years, you've got a really nice new blueberry bush. You have to be careful and not let too many of the shoots survive. So like, I don't know how many are here. You'd probably want to just let have about 8 canes survive over the first couple of years. Okay, what else? So I'd also mentioned birds. Birds are a real problem. They're a huge problem with blueberries, growing blueberries. And so this was at a growers meeting several years ago, but this blueberry planting back here, this netting is called Smart Net, and it's a very nice netting. But you need, as you can see, a whole structure, and it works well. It's a it can be kind of a pain in the neck to set up. And I've seen some people where they store it outside, like all bunched up at the end of the row. But then you can have problems with mice getting in there in the wintertime. And so I've heard somebody say that they were having good luck storing their netting by putting like dryer sheets, those very scented dryer sheets, putting that in with the netting to help keep the mice out of it, because they can do a lot of damage. So this Smart Net, there's lots of different nettings, but this Smart Net works very well. And this is available through OESCO, which used to be called Orchard Equipment Supply Company. Now they just go by the name OSCO, and this is in Massachusetts, also Western Massachusetts, and a wonderful company to work with for all sorts of large equipment and small equipment and tools. They're really a very good equipment company. So I was just thinking how they also, OSCO always has a big trade show booth up at the New England Vegetable and Fruit Conference. And you guys should consider going up to the conference. It will be this coming December, sometime in the middle. It's like a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in the middle of December. It's as I said, the New England Vegetable and Fruit Conference. And it's a great conference. Growers really like it. It's in Manchester, New Hampshire. If you can go to that this year, if you're really serious about growing, you should plan on going to this conference. It is really good. It's for growers all day long, and it's fun. So I have to talk a little bit about pests and also this big huge pest. So spotted winged Drosophila. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this insect before, or if any of you are growing fruit. It's really changed everything about growing small fruit. It's a horrible insect. I like insects. I really do. I do not like spotted winged Drosophila. It really, I can't say ruined, but it used to be that I would recommend for like backyard growers wanting to grow. I'd say grow raspberries, grow blueberries, because for fruit they're not so hard to grow, and there aren't any really bad pests. Well, that all changed in, I think it was 2011, when spotted winged Drosophila moved into the Northeast. And it's a tiny little fruit fly. It's probably what, 1/3 of an inch long or so. And it comes, and the female, can you see? This insert here is showing, the cat is crying at the door. Go away, cat. This insert is showing the ovipositor, so of the female. So the female can use this. It's a little buzz saw, really. It looks like a saw. If that was clear, you could see that there's teeth on this ovipositor, and she can saw right into the eggs, right into the fruit. And let's see, sorry. Saw into fruit that's still ripening and deposit eggs, and then the little spotted winged Drosophila larvae, they're called larvae, but they're maggots, go tunneling through the fruit and make a real mess of the fruit. So it's called spotted wing because the males have these 2 spots on them. The females don't have spots. Makes them a little bit difficult to identify. But if you've got fruit flies that are visiting your fruit when it's not overripe and when it's not damaged, because our regular fruit flies that we know and love, they go after overripe fruit. They go after damaged fruit. But the spotted winged Drosophila can go after perfectly sound fruit and not even totally ripe fruit. So it's really changed everything. And so, yeah, so here's a lovely little maggot inside this squished blueberries. And the eggs get laid in the fruit, and this is just so it takes a couple days for the eggs to hatch, and then a few days for the larvae to get larger, feeding inside, and then the berries get pretty darn disgusting. And you can have, like, this is probably another one over here. I think I've seen, and definitely here's one here. I think I've seen 5 or 6 maggots inside one blueberry. It's it's pretty gross, besides being economically horrible. And since I'm talking about spotted wing, I just wanted to continue with this dreadful topic and say it's also a problem on strawberries and raspberries. And so strawberries, if you know, there's something called most of the strawberries that we eat are called June-bearing strawberries. And they, we usually start harvesting strawberries around here in late May and through June, and they're called June-bearing strawberries. And then by the 4th of July, it's really pretty well done. Then there's also what's called day neutral strawberries. And day neutral strawberries, you can grow them throughout the year. Excuse me, not throughout the year, throughout the summer. So they start in the summer and into the fall, you can grow these day neutral strawberries. And I'll talk a little bit more about them later. But the spotted-winged Drosophila, it's usually not a problem. We usually start seeing them, like finding them in traps in June. And it isn't until until pretty late in July that they've really built up to huge numbers where they're a problem. So for the June-bearing strawberries, they mostly get by without a problem with spotted-winged Drosophila. And so, yeah, you can usually grow most of your strawberries, unless you have really late varieties. You can grow your strawberries without worrying too much about SWD, it's also called. But those day neutral strawberries that grow all summer long and into the fall they're a huge magnet for spotted-winged Drosophila, and there's a huge problem with spotted-winged Drosophila in day neutral strawberries, as there is in raspberries also. So yeah, so somebody else took this last picture of, this is what the little so an egg gets deposited here by the female, and the egg has this attachment, this hair attachment, where this is the breathing tube for the egg, so it breathes. And so here, this researcher said he counted about 500 eggs, because you can count the threads on this one beautiful looking strawberry. And I had bought some strawberries at a farmer's market that were day neutral strawberries, and I knew they had spotted-winged Drosophila. But I bought them anyway because I wanted to see how many were in there. So this is one strawberry that I let the spotted-winged Drosophila develop, and then these are the pupae of the spotted-winged Drosophila. And oh my gosh, sorry Trish, it looks like you're about to get sick. Sorry, should have this been not right after lunch. Sorry about that. Anyway, a huge problem, as you can see. Yuck. Yeah, that is pretty incredible.
Are we eating these by accident most of the time?
So nothing like this. Like, yeah, you wouldn't be able to eat. I mean, if you just, so when I was looking at the fruit, I could tell that the fruit were kind of like they have a little bit of sunken area. And I knew that there was going to be SWD inside there. So, especially when you buy things at the grocery store, when they're like strawberries that have no flavor, they're picking them super, super early. And yeah, so spotted-winged Drosophila isn't such a problem there. Also, spotted-winged Drosophila really do very well in humid climates. I'm sorry, Trish, I got to get off this picture. I can see you're about to have a fit. Oh no, this one's no better. All right. So spotted-winged Drosophila need humid conditions, and so in desert communities where they're growing fruit, where fruit is grown in California, spotted-winged Drosophila isn't nearly the problem as it is on the East Coast, because the flies need a high humidity to be able to survive. Okay, so yeah, so probably when you buy things at the grocery store, they're not like this, but frozen blueberries, there's probably eggs in there, and not a problem. It's really not a problem. You think of, everything's covered with dust, everything's covered with bacteria, fungal spores. That's the way we need to think about SWD eggs. It's just like not a big deal. When you start seeing the maggots moving around inside, that's a big deal.
Do these have natural predators, or are you going to mention that?
So for spotted-winged, yes, I mean, things do eat it, but so the spotted-winged Drosophila, as I said, we started seeing it in New England in 2011. It found its way into, I think it's California, the West Coast, more Oregon, in like 2008, and then incredibly quickly just spread across the country. And it came from some Asian country to begin with. And so usually when we're trying to figure out like natural predators, when we have an invasive insect, we usually go back to the place of origin and look for like natural predators that could infect it, that could help control it. And there are some natural predators, but even where this insect is native, it's a big problem. So in China, in Japan, spotted-winged Drosophila is still a big problem. And so I don't see much hope for really getting good biological control for spotted-winged Drosophila. Yeah, it's a real shame. So anyway, raspberries also, so sorry about this. Yeah, you can see a maggot here. And I'm sorry, that fruit was pretty cool hanging there. Right, I had to take that picture. Okay, so, and they can, yeah, also I had said that we really don't usually see a few until in June, and then the numbers just build throughout the summer, especially during wet summers like last year, it really built up and into the fall. And so there can be, and it only takes like 10 days for a generation to go through, like in the height of the summer. So the numbers just build like crazy, like crazy. Let me look at the chat. Oh, don't take a blowtorch to your strawberries. That's right, a little protein. Yep. Okay. Yeah, and also, so I mean, there are places where, like for blueberries, yeah. So they build up more on the raspberries and the strawberries, the day neutral strawberries, than they do on blueberries. Because as I said, I think the most I've seen is 5, 6, or 7, maybe 8 maggots in one blueberry versus that strawberry. Now the strawberry is bigger, but anyway, the blueberries aren't quite as susceptible to huge numbers, but still, it makes them unsaleable, that's for sure. And they just build up into tremendous numbers. So big problem. Oh, what I was going to say though also is there are places that can grow like blueberries and they really don't spray much at all. And the way they do this, well, I'll show you some pictures of some netting, but also without netting, picking really frequently. And so trying to get, as many of the berries out of there when they're ripe, and then chilling them immediately. If you're selling berries, you should have a way to reduce the temperature so that the eggs don't hatch as quickly, so the maggots don't develop as quickly. But also, if you can get them down to, I think it's 32 degrees, where the berries aren't going to freeze, but I think that can actually kill the larvae in the fruit. So, which, I mean, it sounds so bad, but it works. And because you think, oh, well, I don't want dead larvae in my fruit. But if they're small enough, it's really not going to be a problem. So anyway, doing frequent picking and cooling down the fruit, that's very helpful. And then also, I had mentioned that the fruit flies, the adults really need high humidity. So doing whatever you can to reduce the humidity in the berry patch, keeping things well pruned, keeping weeds, eliminating weeds, having mulch, doing the drip irrigation so that the moisture is just going to the soil and to the roots. So anything you can do to reduce the relative humidity. Now, when we have a wet summer, that's all gone. There's nothing you can do. Yeah, so when you have a wet year, it's just, there's no way you can reduce the humidity. I did want to, let's see. So there is this netting called exclusion netting, and this is very fine. They're tough material, but it's very fine, and it's small enough to keep out spotted-winged Drosophila, because they're fruit flies. That smart net that I was showing you before. Of course, anything except for birds can fit through there, but this exclusion netting works really well, especially for blueberries. It's expensive. And you need the structure there to put around it, so it's not really feasible for a large blueberry planting, but for a small one, it really makes a lot of sense. And this is the backside over here, and I just wanted to show you here having like this airlock kind of. It's not an airlock, of course, but having this double entrance to help keep spotted wing from going into the enclosure. Is really helpful because if a few spotted wings get in there, they've got a really nice environment to reproduce. this works really well for blueberries because blueberries, the plants flower in May over like a 2 to 3 week period, and then they're done flowering. And so then you would put up the structure and keep the spider wing out. With raspberries or blackberries, they flower continually. They flower and produce fruit. And so for pollinating, that's what I didn't mention. So for pollinating, you need to have some kind of pollinator in there if you're going to make this enclosure for raspberry production. But for blueberries, you can wait until the flowers have been out there and they've been fertilized by the bees, and then you can put this up and protect the berries. But with raspberries, since they keep producing fruit and flowers all year long, all summer long, you would want to, it's harder to use this. You'd need to introduce like bumblebees, or you'd need to put in some kind of pollinator in there so that the plants, the flowers can get pollinated. But this structure also works really well for birds. And it's like, well, yeah, of course it would work well for birds, but it's like the birds can't even see that there's plants in there that they're interested in. Where if you've ever gone blueberry picking where there's a netting over the berries, birds are always getting in there and getting tangled in the net, and the pickers don't like that. The birds don't like that. You don't like that. And it's a real pain in the neck. What I've seen with this exclusion netting is the birds don't even know that there's berries in there, so they're not trying to get in, and you don't have that kind of bird problem where you're trying to untangle birds from
netting. So anyway, there's that advantage. It is expensive. There's this place, the Berry Patch, that sells this exclusion netting, or exclude net, I guess she calls it. I'm not sure if other places are selling it now as well. She used to be the only North American distributor. I'm not sure if that's still the case or not. Okay, so a little bit about blueberry varieties. How are we doing here? Yikes, I'm talking too much. Okay, as I had mentioned, Norse Nurseries is a great place to go and buy blueberry plants. And you really, if you're not going to be doing exclusion netting, I would really just go after early or mid-season ripening blueberries. And the public doesn't seem as interested in late season varieties. They're just, I don't know if they're just not as good or what. But let's see. And in 2019, I did a survey of growers and to see what varieties they were growing and what they liked. And by far, so each was one person. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people out of, I think it was 14 people that I really got information from, 14 commercial growers. So Blue Crop was like the favorite one. Now Chandler is a very nice blueberry bush. I'm just going to go through these quickly because you can take a look at these later if you're interested. These 3 people were saying that some people liked them, some people don't, but there weren't all that many people growing them. And then these ones were saying, I wish I never planted these. And at least 3 of these, Elliott, Corville, and Late Blue, are all very late seasons. And yeah, I haven't seen a late season berry that I'm really happy with yet. And I'm not sure about Rika, and Patriots, I think, pretty late as well. Now there are newer varieties, so it seemed like the growers that I asked, none of them had really planted newer varieties. There is we have a blueberry grower that just started, and he's planted these 3 varieties that I know nothing about, and they came from this Fall Creek nursery in Oregon. And I don't know if it's true with these berries, but it seems to me that a lot of times that new blueberry varieties, they are selected because they machine harvest well. So we're talking big, huge blueberry production, and they're good for machine harvesting, and so maybe not for other features that we care a lot about, like flavor. I don't know about Fall Creek.
it seems like that might not be the case with this nursery. So anyway, I'm interested to see how these new varieties do. And as I mentioned, so at Norse, they say, if you read it, they will grow. And they just has, I'm just going to just quick go through this, see if this works anyway. Let me see. Oh, maybe not. Just, yeah, I gotta get to this. See if I can do this. Can you, so you can see this? Can you see? I'm just going through the book. It just, you know, it just has so much information about how to plant. And yeah, I'm really pleased with them. Okay, let's see. How do I get back to my PowerPoint? I think this is it. Okay. So yeah, it is just good. All right. So I did want to talk a little bit about some of the other fruits. And for strawberries, so it seems like for various reasons, there is not that many strawberry growers, especially in Rhode Island. We have very few strawberry growers left. It seemed a lot of them, I think some for disease problems in the soil, that they stopped growing and they didn't have land to rotate to. Pick your own in general, people talk about like the height of pick your own was like in 1980 or so, and it's been declining ever since. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd have to believe people about that. But it seems like a lot of growers have gotten out. This is like throughout New England, they've gotten out of doing pick your own, and because the berries are just too valuable. It's hard work to grow them, and they're hard to grow, so they pick them themselves, and then they'll sell them at their market, you know, at the farmer's market or at their farm stand, rather than let pick your own people go in. So I think of strawberries as really being kind of more labor intensive. It's certainly lower to the ground, you know, than the blueberries are. So it's just, you know, physically very difficult to do, more difficult to do than say blueberries, which are at a nice height. But there is a lot of work with like hand work with the strawberries, pinching off flowers and removing runners until anyway, just a lot of plant maintenance. And so yes, I sort of mentioned that there's a lot of soil pathogens that build up over the time. And so you really need to rotate out of strawberries. Like you might have this field for, you know, a few years in strawberries, and then you've got to go and move to some different land to be able to plant more strawberries. And I remember one grower telling me that for having 5 acres of strawberries, he really felt like he needed to donate or dedicate like 15 acres to strawberries. I mean, he could be growing other things during those years as well, but you need a lot of land to be able to rotate it around. The strawberry fields can last anywhere from 1 to 4 years. I mean, 1 sounds really short, but especially for organic growers or growers planting those day neutral strawberries that I mentioned before, they're often just planting them as an annual crop. As I said, the pathogens build up or insects build up, and the plants just will not do well if you try and keep them for too long. And weeds, for any, whether it's vegetables or fruit, weeds are a huge issue, and you just need to stay on top of them, or they really will cause you problems. And plants like raspberries and strawberries themselves, they keep multiplying, and they can become weeds to themselves. So you really need to, well, for strawberries, we call it renovating. If you're growing a June bearing crop, you want to renovate it, which means you're going to be mowing it down right after harvest and narrowing up the rows back to the row width that they should be. So anyway, just something you need to do each year. And then the strawberries, I think they're difficult. They're very susceptible to weather. I mean, all crops are, but for strawberries, you need to cover the plants with straw in the winter so that the crowns of the plants don't die on really cold nights, really cold times in the winter. And then also in the spring, they flower early. And then there's often, evenings or mornings where there's going to be frost problems. And so either you need to cover them with a row cover, or you need like water that'll be frost protection. And then also during harvest, if it's rainy, well, there's a lot of disease problems and slug problems. And, so rain during harvest is bad. And then also or heat during strawberry season, harvest season is bad. All right, I'm not going to say anything more about growing day neutrals. But yeah, there's information. This is straight out of that nursery guide. This one too. Okay, so yeah, as I said, there's step-by-step information. So a little bit about growing raspberries, and they're wonderful. The people love raspberries. You can get very good price at the markets, as you can for blueberries and strawberries as well.
Heather, before you
Yes.
move on to raspberries, there was a question about vertical growing techniques for strawberries and if you found any to be effective.
So I haven't seen anybody really do it. There's a grower in Rhode Island that had talked about making elevated, growing things like up on pallets. I don't know how well that would work. I mean, it should work for strawberries, but I have not seen it I haven't seen it work. I haven't seen anybody really try it, seriously, other than just a curiosity kind of thing in a greenhouse. But yeah, I mean, you just need to have enough soil there. Yeah, I really don't know anything much about it at all. Sorry. So problems with raspberries, there's a lot of pruning required. You just need to keep the plants in check. Trellis is required. Also, very sensitive to the weather. They're very perishable, as you know, raspberries are. If you're going to be doing pick your own, it's hard to get the pick your owners not to eat raspberries. They could, eat as many as they're going to pay you for. So that's a problem. And spotted wing, we know about spotted wing problems. So just a little bit about the biology of the plant. So this is when a cane first comes up, it's called the primocane. And so that'll be the first year of its growth. And then the second year, that primocane becomes what we call a floricane. And that's when it produces the flowers and then the fruit. And that'll only live for 1 year, the floricane. It'll produce fruit and then die. So then you need to prune it out. So you need to continually, at the end of the season, get rid of the spent ones and keep the primocanes and not let them be growing too close together. So yeah, you can see here. So this cane is now dead and would need to be pruned out. And just like with the strawberries, the plants themselves, they send up a lot of those new canes from the roots or from the stolons. And you just need to make sure that you're pruning to keep them like 6 to 8 inches apart. So these should be pruned a little bit more than they are. I want to mention thornless blackberries, gorgeous crop. You can really do pretty well with thornless blackberries, but they're very vigorous plants, and you need to have a trellis system, a sturdy trellis to be able to hold them, hold up the plants. And the thornless blackberries, yeah, you don't want thorned ones, you want thornless ones. They're not as winter hardy as other berries, but certainly in Rhode Island and in southern New England, the thornless blackberries can work very well. They're very susceptible to SWD. The blackberries usually get ripened about the beginning of August, right when spotted wing is really peaking out. I didn't mention spraying insecticides. There are insecticides that you can spray for the spotted wing Drosophila, but you're still going to get them in there. I mean, it helps suppress the insects, even just like weekly sprays of insecticide. It's kind of horrible to think about, but you know, most of the growers are spraying insecticides to try and keep down the number of spotted wing Drosophila. Nasty insect, as I said. So yeah, the blackberries are very, very vigorous, and you need to prune them heavily and keep like this should be pruned in the summertime, because you can see the fruit down here, but it's kind of hard to get to. Norse Nurseries was promoting this swing arm trellis, and I won't go into it, but they have like a recipe for how to grow these, and then the swing arm swings down so you can cover them and protect them better for the winter time. And then you swing them up at the proper time, and all the fruit is very exposed and easy to pick. So there's quite a bit of information about that available. So yeah, as I had mentioned in the beginning, you know, the cooperative extension in all the New England states and all the states in the country are there to help farmers, or there to help growers. And so you really want to take advantage of the resources that are in your state. Every state has a plant diagnostic clinic to help you figure out what's wrong, because there's going to be something wrong. But it helps you identify insect disease and weed problems. So be sure and know about these resources. And I think, I am going to stop there. Okay. So, sorry, I kind of zipped through this. I hadn't given this talk before. I didn't know how long I was going to take. But are there some other questions anybody wants to ask? All right. Yeah,
I can ask one.
Yes.
Oh, I was just wondering about like raspberries. I've got like some, I guess, just like growing around the property, and someone else that has some on their property, like transplanting them. They do fairly well digging them up, or
Well, they do, but the way I understand it is there's a lot of viruses that can attack raspberry plants, and so if it's an old planting, they probably have some viruses, and the production just probably isn't going to be as good, and maybe the plants aren't going to produce well at all. So it's really recommended to start with clean plants, but it's certainly worth trying and seeing how they look. But yeah, it's really recommended to get new plants and try and have them away from wild or old plantings.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Josh.
Are there like certain varieties of the plants that are not as susceptible to the fruit fly?
So like varieties of blueberries or something like that?
Yeah, like is there a certain like species that seem to be not as affected?
Not for those small fruits. So for grapes, like spotted wing can also attack grapes, but the most of the grape skins are thick, and so most varieties the spotted wing doesn't attack, but any of the thinner skin varieties of I don't know if that is for table grapes, but certainly there's some wine grapes that are very thin skinned, and the spotted wing goes after them very well. As far as for blueberries or raspberries or blackberries, no. It's only with timing, trying to grow the crop before spotted wing builds up to horrible numbers. And so for blueberries, so you can have the Juneberry strawberries, they do pretty well, and the early to mid-season blueberry varieties do well. You're trying to avoid it rather than really having resistance to it, because they like any kind of dark red, something that size. But even figs, I know, I heard, or I've seen them in cherry tomatoes, but more they have to attack, I think, tomatoes that have been damaged or cracked. Then you can get spotted wing in like cherry tomatoes also. But they're mostly a berry problem.
And figs too, right, Heather?
So that's what I had heard. There was one fig grower that was saying his figs were getting attacked by spotted wing, but it could have been that he was leaving them on too long. I did, Trish said that you have a fig grower in your group. And there is a fig grower in Cranston who's growing figs in greenhouses and selling them in his farm stand and doing really well. He is really pleased with how well his figs are selling. So I think he started out with like 100 fig plants in a greenhouse, and yeah, he's really pleased with them. So it's not a fruit, but one other vegetable that I think is undergrown in Rhode Island that I think people could do well with is asparagus. And Norse also sells asparagus plants. Anyway, if you're considering growing, I think asparagus could be something that is, there's not many grown. It's ready to harvest early in the season, so you need to have a market that's ready that could sell it for you, or that you can sell it because it's ready in like April and May. So early season, where like outside some farmers markets usually aren't open then. So you just need to know where you're going to sell it.
Any more
Okay.
questions? No, I think we're great. Thank you so much, Heather.
Oh, sure. And if you have questions, Trish, you can send, give people my email if you'd like, if you have questions, or yeah. So I'm retired, but I like this stuff. And so I'm staying involved with it. I'm staying involved with the Rhode Island Fruit Growers Association. And anyway, I'm not moving to Florida or Arizona. That's for sure. Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much. Good luck, you guys. All righty.
Hi, Heather.
Bye-bye. I'll stop sharing.
Okay. So class, we do have a homework assignment. If you've seen it in Brightspace, it's just to kind of gather some information for 3 crops that you're planning on growing. There's some details on the assignments page, and submit that just to get you thinking a little bit about what was taught today. Any other questions? All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good week.
I wanted to ask something, Trisha, actually, but
Sure.